The air was thick with the scent of olive oil and burning incense. Beneath the open sky, a woman knelt before an altar carved from ancient stone, her hands trembling as she poured wine onto the earth. The liquid soaked into the ground, a crimson offering to the gods who watched from their lofty thrones on Mount Olympus. Nearby, a child clutched a small clay figurine, his eyes wide with awe as he whispered a prayer taught by his grandmother. These were not extraordinary moments in ancient Greece, they were the heartbeat of everyday life, where rituals intertwined with the very fabric of existence. Rituals in ancient Greece were more than acts of devotion, they were lifelines to a world brimming with divine presence. Every breath, every step, every word seemed to carry the weight of an unspoken agreement with forces greater than oneself. The morning began not with idle chatter but with reverence. A farmer, before tending to his fields, would kneel to honor Demeter, the goddess of agriculture, asking for her blessing to bring forth a bountiful harvest. Without this gesture, he believed his labor might be in vain, his crops withering under an unkind sun. Children were taught early to feel the gods in every corner of their lives. Before their first meal, they learned to sprinkle a bit of food onto the floor, a humble gift to Hestia, goddess of the hearth, to thank her for warmth and sustenance. Even the simplest acts carried the weight of eternity. A fisherman casting his net would murmur words to Poseidon, his voice barely audible above the crash of waves, knowing that without the sea god's favor, the waters could turn against him in a heartbeat. Festivals were perhaps the most vivid expression of how rituals shaped the lives of the Greeks. Entire cities would come alive in celebration, their streets filled with music, dance, and the smell of roasted meat. The Panathenaic festival in Athens, dedicated to Athena, their protector, was a spectacle of unity and devotion. Families would dress in their finest clothes, each member carrying something to offer. The procession moved like a living river, vibrant and unstoppable, flowing toward the Acropolis where sacrifices were made. Children, wide-eyed and thrilled, would watch as the priests raised their blades to the throats of animals, their fur glistening under the sun. It was a stark reminder of life's fragility, balanced delicately between human hands and divine will. But it wasn't always grand celebrations. Sometimes, rituals were quiet, almost secretive. In a dimly lit corner of her home, a woman would light a lamp and whisper to Aphrodite, asking for love that didn't yet exist or for a marriage that was slowly unraveling. There was a vulnerability in these private moments, a rawness that echoed through the ages. It wasn't about grand gestures, it was about connection. For every elaborate ceremony, there were countless intimate acts that tethered people to the unseen forces they believed shaped their lives. The rituals of the dead held an unmatched power to stir the soul. When someone passed away, the air grew heavy with a solemn reverence. Women gathered to wash the body, their hands steadied but hearts aching as they anointed the skin with oils. They sang laments that seemed to pierce the heavens, their voices trembling with sorrow and defiance, as if daring the gods to take another loved one. Coins were placed over the eyes of the deceased, a fare for Charon, the ferryman of the underworld. Without this offering, the soul would wander, lost, unable to cross the river Styx. There was no greater fear than being forgotten, trapped in limbo, denied the peace of the afterlife. Even in the midst of war, rituals stood as pillars of hope. Before a battle, soldiers would gather around their general, who would sacrifice a ram or goat to Ares, the god of war. The blood would spill onto the earth, a stark reminder of the cost of what they were about to face. In the stillness before the clash of swords, they prayed for strength, for survival, for glory. Some kissed their amulets, small tokens blessed by priests, clutching them as if the gods themselves were within reach. In the quieter moments, rituals became a source of solace. A mother, worried about her child's illness, would visit the temple of Asclepius, the god of healing. She would leave a small figurine, a carving of the body part she hoped to be cured, at the altar. The sight of countless offerings, each one a story of pain and hope, was both overwhelming and comforting. It was a shared vulnerability, a reminder that she was not alone in her desperation. Nature itself was inseparable from these acts of devotion. The rustling of leaves in sacred groves was believed to be the whisper of gods. Streams, caves, and mountains weren't just landscapes, they were sanctuaries. A shepherd leading his flock would pause to acknowledge a nearby spring, leaving behind a handful of wool as a sign of gratitude to the nymphs who guarded the waters. This reverence for nature wasn't born out of fear, it was rooted in an understanding of its sacred essence, a relationship nurtured through countless generations. There was no part of life untouched by ritual. From birth to death, from planting seeds to reaping harvests, the Greeks lived in constant conversation with their gods. Every action was imbued with meaning, every moment a bridge between the mortal and the divine. Their rituals weren't just about pleasing the gods, they were a way of making sense of a world filled with uncertainty and wonder. To them, the gods weren't distant beings, they were as real as the earth beneath their feet, the sun on their skin, and the stars that guided their ships through treacherous waters. The night was silent, save for the faint rustle of leaves stirred by a gentle wind. Beneath the silver gaze of the moon, a small group of figures moved in shadow, their faces hidden by dark hoods. They gathered around a solitary fire in a clearing, its flames casting flickering shapes on the trees that loomed like silent witnesses. In their hands were objects that seemed ordinary, an animal bone, a clay pot, a bundle of herbs, but together they held a weight that could shatter lives. This was not an act of devotion, but an act of defiance, a step into a forbidden world where gods were not forgiving. There were rituals in ancient Greece that no one dared to speak of in daylight. Practices whispered about in hushed tones, practices that carried the stench of danger and power. To perform them was to risk everything: exile, divine wrath, even death. These rituals, shrouded in secrecy, held a magnetic allure. Why did people risk so much? What could drive someone to cross a line that even the gods had drawn? The forbidden began where fear lived. The gods, though revered, were unpredictable, and their anger could bring famine, plague, or war. Some believed that there were ways to bend the will of these celestial beings, to force their hand. Blood spilled in the wrong place, at the wrong time, could open doors that should have stayed locked. It was said that certain sacrifices, those too dark to name, could grant a mortal unimaginable power, but at what cost? In a village tucked away in the hills, there was once a farmer whose fields refused to bear fruit. Desperate, he turned to a wandering seer who spoke of a secret rite. At midnight, the man stood alone in his barren field, holding a blade that gleamed unnaturally under the moonlight. He whispered prayers not to Demeter but to darker, nameless entities. The next season, his fields flourished beyond imagination, the earth bursting with crops. But soon, whispers spread of strange shadows moving through his home at night, of animals found lifeless with no wounds to explain their deaths. The villagers avoided his gaze, and he died alone, his bountiful fields overtaken by thorns. Some practices were taboo because they sought to disrupt the natural order. In the temples of Hades, the god of the underworld, death was sacred, a boundary not meant to be crossed. Yet, there were those who sought to summon the dead, to tear souls from their eternal rest. Necromancy was among the most feared of forbidden practices, a crime against the gods and the living alike. The tales of those who dared to perform it were chilling. An old woman, mourning her child, was said to have invoked the dead in a grove sacred to Persephone. The earth trembled, and the voice of her child echoed through the trees, but it was not the voice she remembered. It was hollow, filled with anger, and it cursed her for disturbing its peace. She was found days later, her hair turned white, her face frozen in terror. The use of human blood in rituals was another line not meant to be crossed. Animal sacrifices were common, but the blood of men or women belonged to the gods alone, given only in battle or natural death. Yet, there were whispers of those who dared to offer human life in their rites, believing it held a power that no animal sacrifice could match. A temple priestess, in love with a soldier destined to die in war, was said to have performed such a rite. She spilled her own blood to the god of war, begging him to spare her beloved. He returned from the battlefield unharmed, but she was struck with madness, her screams echoing through the temple until her final breath. Forbidden practices often revolved around the manipulation of fate. The Greeks believed that the Moirai, the fates, wove the threads of every life, and to tamper with their work was to invite disaster. Yet, there were those who sought to change their destiny through unsanctioned means. A young man, fearful of an oracle's prophecy that he would die at sea, sought out an old sorcerer. The sorcerer instructed him to bury a black rooster under a sycamore tree during a thunderstorm, an act said to deceive the fates. The man lived a long life, never setting foot near the sea, but died choking on a fishbone, a cruel twist that seemed to prove the fates' power could never be truly undone. The most haunting tales of forbidden rituals often involve children. To harm a child, to use their innocence in any rite, was considered the greatest of sins. Yet, in the dark corners of history, there are murmurs of such acts. A mother, desperate to save her ailing family, was said to have turned to an ancient, forbidden prayer that required her to sacrifice her child's laughter. For the rest of his life, the boy never smiled, and the family prospered, but at what cost? The weight of such choices lingered like a shadow over their bloodline for generations. The forbidden was often tied to the unknown. Strange rites practiced by foreign visitors, misunderstood and feared, were labeled as dangerous. The rites of the Thracians, with their wild dances and frenzied sacrifices, struck terror into the hearts of those who witnessed them. Even the worship of Dionysus, with its ecstatic, chaotic energy, was once considered subversive, its rituals outlawed in some places before becoming accepted. The line between what was sacred and what was forbidden was not always clear, and it shifted with the tides of fear and power. In the quietest moments of the forbidden, there was a sense of longing, of desperation that pushed people to act against their own beliefs. A father holding his dying child might whisper a prayer he knew was forbidden, his voice shaking with tears, because the gods of the hearth and healing had not answered. A widow, unable to move past her grief, might light a candle in secret to spirits she didn't understand, hoping for just one more moment with the one she loved. These practices were not just acts of rebellion or greed, they were the cries of the desperate, the actions of those who felt abandoned by the gods they had worshipped all their lives. They were risks taken in the hope of changing the unchangeable, of bending the universe just enough to survive one more day. And in that raw, human vulnerability lay the true weight of the forbidden. The air was thick with dust, the kind that clings to your skin and settles in your throat. A lone archaeologist knelt in the shade of a crumbling temple, his fingers brushing against something unexpected, smooth and cool, unlike the rough stone around it. With trembling hands, he unearthed a fragment of pottery, its surface etched with faint markings. They weren't ordinary decorations, they were symbols, precise and deliberate, as if someone centuries ago had wanted their message to outlast the ruin itself. What kind of message was so urgent it had to be hidden beneath the earth, waiting for hands like his to uncover it? Evidence of the forbidden has a way of calling out, even through the silence of centuries. The shards of broken rituals lie scattered across Greece, their voices hushed but not silenced. In sanctuaries where gods were openly celebrated, there are signs of offerings meant for different, shadowed purposes. Tiny statues of clay, shaped like figures mid-prayer, lie buried beneath layers of time. Their faces are twisted, pleading or fearful, suggesting they weren't meant to honor but to beg. Nearby, charred bones of animals, sometimes even human remains, tell of ceremonies that went beyond the sanctioned sacrifices of temple priests. In a remote cave near the slopes of Mount Parnassus, archaeologists found a collection of items that seemed out of place. A bronze knife, too small for practical use but sharp enough for precision, rested beside a row of polished stones inscribed with words no one fully understood. The air in the cave felt heavy, as if it remembered the chants that had once echoed within its walls. Some believed the stones were used to call upon the underworld, a language known only to the daring or the desperate. The knife, they whispered, might have been used in rites to pierce the veil between the living and the dead. Ancient texts hold their own haunting power. The Greeks were master storytellers, weaving tales of gods and heroes into vibrant epics, but in the margins of their histories and plays, there are glimpses of something darker. A playwright might mention a ritual in passing, a sacrifice performed at the wrong time or to the wrong god, its consequences rippling through the story like an unseen curse. Hesiod spoke of days when the gods walked among mortals, and when mortals crossed forbidden lines. These passing mentions feel like warnings, as if the authors knew too well the price of speaking plainly about such things. The Orphic hymns, those enigmatic verses whispered in secret ceremonies, carry an undeniable weight. They sing not only of life and light but of shadows and mysteries too dangerous for open worship. Written in cryptic language, they hint at practices meant to transcend mortality, to see what lies beyond the last breath. Reading them, one feels the pull of something ancient and untamed, a force that can't be fully grasped but demands to be felt. Yet, not all evidence rests in objects or written words. Oral traditions, passed down from one generation to the next, hold memories that refuse to fade. In small villages, elders tell stories of rituals performed in hidden groves under the cover of night. Their voices drop to whispers when speaking of what should never be repeated, their eyes darting toward unseen presences, as if even the mention could summon something best left undisturbed. These tales are not told to entertain but to warn, each word carrying the weight of those who live through the consequences. One such story tells of a woman who, on the advice of a wandering mystic, performed a secret ritual to save her child from sickness. She followed the mystic's instructions, gathering herbs under the full moon and reciting phrases in a language foreign to her tongue. The child recovered, but her household was plagued by unexplainable misfortunes. Animals fled from her land, crops withered, and her neighbors avoided her gaze. Her descendants whispered that her act had cursed the family for generations, a reminder of the cost of stepping where mortals were not meant to tread. Even the grand temples, with their gleaming marble columns and sacred altars, carry scars of hidden rituals. On one temple floor, faint stains and scratches form patterns too deliberate to be accidents. Scholars say they resemble diagrams meant to channel energy, to summon or bind forces beyond human comprehension. These markings, worn by centuries of footsteps, hold secrets that no one dares to confirm aloud. A letter from an Athenian nobleman, preserved on brittle papyrus, speaks of a relative caught performing unsanctioned rites. He describes his shame, the swift punishment, and the fear that lingered in his household afterward. The words tremble on the page, as if the writer's hand shook with the weight of what he knew but could not erase. "We do not speak his name," he wrote, "lest the gods think we condone his actions." In Delphi, home of the famous oracle, there are stories of secretive acts carried out not by the Pythia but by those desperate to control their fates. A bronze tablet unearthed near the temple lists names of enemies, each name accompanied by a plea to the gods to destroy them. The words are scratched so deeply into the metal that it seems the writer wanted to ensure their anger reached beyond the mortal plane. Nearby, small figurines with broken limbs lie buried, as if someone had tried to cripple their foes through the objects that represented them. The most haunting evidence comes not from items or texts, but from the silence that surrounds them. Gaps in history where rituals are hinted at but never fully explained. Sudden disappearances of individuals accused of forbidden acts. Changes in laws that outlaw practices no one dared to describe in detail. These silences speak louder than words, a void filled with the weight of fear and reverence. What remains of these forbidden practices is scattered, fragmented, and incomplete, yet each piece feels like it carries the breath of those who once lived it. A ceramic shard, a line of verse, a whispered story, all are traces of a world that exists just beyond the reach of understanding. They stand as reminders of a time when the line between the sacred and the forbidden was razor-thin, and crossing it meant stepping into the unknown, carrying the weight of both hope and terror. The flickering light of a lone torch danced across the cavern walls, casting shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. A figure stood at the center of a circle carved into the rocky floor, their voice low and trembling as they chanted an ancient invocation. Around them lay offerings, a small jar of honey, a bundle of dried herbs, and the faint metallic gleam of a knife. The words they spoke were not of reverence, but of summoning, calling upon forces whispered about in hushed tones, forces rooted in the myths of gods and heroes but steeped in something far darker. Greek mythology is filled with stories that sing of grandeur, tragedy, and the divine. Yet beneath the surface of these tales lies an undercurrent of mystery, a shadowed connection to rituals carried out far from the golden light of temples. In these myths, gods were not only revered but also feared, their wrath avoided through rituals that skirted the edges of what was considered acceptable. Zeus's thunder, Hecate's midnight blessings, and Persephone's underworld descent all became intertwined with acts that promised power or protection but demanded a price few dared to pay. In the quiet of night, worshippers sought Hecate, goddess of magic and crossroads. Her myths tell of a deity who wandered between the living and the dead, her torches guiding souls through the darkness. Those who sought her aid were said to leave offerings at three-way crossroads: cakes, honey, and sometimes the blood of a sacrificed animal. These rituals, whispered to hold the power to grant visions or influence fate, were never spoken of openly. To call upon Hecate was to step into the unknown, to invite her shadowed presence into one's life. The myth of Persephone, torn from the fields of spring and cast into the underworld, held its own eerie resonance. While her abduction by Hades is often told as a tale of loss and eventual renewal, it also inspired clandestine rites aimed at understanding death itself. In hidden groves, initiates reenacted her descent, donning black veils and walking in silence through moonlit paths. It was said that those who partook might glimpse the mysteries of the afterlife, their souls forever marked by what they had seen. Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstasy, also carried a darker association. While his myths celebrated the freedom of spirit and the joy of indulgence, they hinted at the dangerous edge of excess. His worshippers, known as Maenads, were said to enter frenzied states, tearing apart animals in acts of raw, primal violence. Some believed these acts weren't mere celebrations, but attempts to channel the god's wild, untamed power. Hidden within these rituals was a yearning to transcend the human experience, to become something more, even if only for a fleeting moment. Even the mighty Zeus, king of the gods, had his share of shadowed connections. Myths of his punishments often warned mortals of the consequences of crossing divine boundaries. Yet, in secret, there were those who sought his favor through forbidden acts. A fragment of pottery discovered near Olympia bore an inscription invoking Zeus Katibates, Zeus the Descender, asking him to strike down an enemy. The words were scratched hastily, as if the writer feared being caught, their desperation etched into the clay. Oracles, too, played a role in the intertwining of mythology and the occult. The Pythia of Delphi, known for her cryptic prophecies, often spoke in riddles that seemed to echo the whispers of the gods themselves. Yet some believed that beneath her public declarations lay a deeper, hidden layer of knowledge. Ancient accounts speak of secretive consultations, where only those deemed worthy were granted access to truths too dangerous for the masses. These moments, shrouded in secrecy, were said to reveal not only the will of the gods, but also the workings of unseen forces. Stories of the Furies, vengeful spirits born from the blood of a mutilated god, also played a part in these hidden rituals. Their myths tell of relentless pursuit, of justice carried out in its most terrifying form. Those seeking vengeance were said to call upon the Furies through acts of ritual purification, bathing in rivers under the light of the moon and speaking curses that resonated with the weight of their pain. To summon them was to gamble with forces beyond control, forces that cared nothing for the line between justice and destruction. Even the humble hearth, presided over by Hestia, carried its own secretive practices. The hearth was the heart of the home, its fire a connection to the divine. Yet some families performed private rites in its glow, whispering prayers for protection or prosperity that they dared not voice aloud. These acts, simple yet powerful, were rooted in a belief that even the most ordinary aspects of life could touch the sacred. The myths of ancient Greece are filled with gods who walked among mortals, shaping their fates and demanding their reverence. Yet they also hint at a darker truth, that the line between the divine and the forbidden was never clear. To honor the gods was to invite their power, but to seek more than their blessings was to risk everything. Myths became a bridge to the unknown, their stories not just tales of glory but echoes of rituals performed in shadows, where the line between reverence and defiance blurred, and mortals dared to reach for the unattainable. The old man's voice trembled as he whispered, his eyes darting toward the darkened forest beyond the village. "Never speak of it. Not here, not now, not ever." His words, heavy with fear, hung in the air, pressing down on the boy who had dared to ask. The boy didn't need to ask again. Some truths weren't meant to be spoken, and some acts weren't meant to be performed, not because they were impossible, but because they were too dangerous, too corrupting, too close to tearing the fragile fabric that held the world together. In ancient Greece, the line between what was sacred and what was forbidden was drawn not with ink but with blood and ash. It wasn't the rituals themselves that marked this boundary, but the shadows they cast, the unease they left behind, and the silent, collective agreement of what should never be attempted. For the Greeks, the act of crossing that line meant challenging not just the gods, but the very order of the universe. To understand what made a ritual forbidden, one only had to look at how the Greeks perceived harmony. They called it cosmos, the balance of all things, a cosmic dance where mortals, gods, and nature moved in perfect rhythm. Rituals were a way to honor that balance, to connect the mortal world with the divine in ways that were acceptable, respectful, and safe. But when a ritual stepped outside those boundaries, it became something else entirely. It became an act of hubris, an offense against the gods, or an opening for forces better left undisturbed. Blood, they believed, had power. It wasn't just a life force, it was a binding agent between the mortal and the divine. Animal sacrifices were common, their purpose clear and their methods ritualized. But when bloodletting shifted to the human realm, when a blade sliced flesh not meant to be offered, it transformed from an act of devotion to a symbol of desecration. The Greeks whispered of cults that performed human sacrifices, offering the lives of men, women, or children to appease gods that mainstream society had long abandoned. Such acts were forbidden not only because they were violent, but because they tore at the very notion of community. They broke trust, they broke order, and they invited chaos. Some rituals veered into the forbidden because they sought to manipulate the gods rather than honor them. A woman kneeling before an altar of Artemis might beg for a safe childbirth. That was acceptable. But if she sought to force the goddess's hand, to compel her with charms, potions, or incantations, she crossed into dangerous territory. To the Greeks, the gods were not to be commanded. They were to be approached with humility and reverence. Any attempt to coerce them was seen as blasphemy, an act of reckless pride that could bring ruin not just to the individual but to the entire community. The dead were another source of unease. Funerary rites were sacred, carefully structured to ensure the soul's peaceful passage to the afterlife. But there were those who sought to disrupt that process, to pull the dead back into the world of the living. Necromancy, the art of communing with spirits, was a practice shrouded in fear and condemnation. To call upon the dead was to risk disturbing the delicate boundary between life and death, inviting spirits that might not come willingly or might not leave once summoned. Then there were the rites performed in secrecy, away from the prying eyes of society. Mystery cults were a common feature of Greek religion, their practices hidden from outsiders and often misunderstood. But while some mysteries, like those of Demeter and Persephone, were widely respected, others carried a darker reputation. It wasn't the secrecy itself that made these rituals forbidden, but the nature of what they sought to achieve. Initiates who pledged themselves to obscure deities or primal forces were often accused of engaging in acts that undermined societal values. Whether these accusations were true or exaggerated, the suspicion alone was enough to cast a shadow over their practices. Sexual acts, too, held the power to shift a ritual from sacred to forbidden. While Greek religion often embraced sexuality as a natural and even divine force, there were limits to what was considered acceptable. Acts performed outside the bounds of consent, acts that defied social norms, or acts that sought to manipulate others through desire were condemned. When sexuality became a tool for power rather than a celebration of life, it became taboo. The Greeks also feared rituals that sought knowledge beyond what mortals were meant to know. Divination was an accepted practice, with oracles like the Pythia offering cryptic glimpses into the will of the gods. But there were those who sought answers through darker means, casting lots soaked in blood, reading omens in the entrails of humans, or calling upon forces not of Olympus but of the underworld. These practices were seen as an overreach, a theft of knowledge that belonged to the divine. What truly made a ritual forbidden, however, was the intent behind it. Acts performed out of love, devotion, or necessity could be forgiven, even if they skirted the edges of propriety. But acts born of greed, anger, or ambition were another matter. To the Greeks, rituals were not just tools, but acts of communion. To misuse them was to break that sacred trust, to spit in the face of the gods, and to risk the wrath that came with such audacity. In the quiet corners of ancient Greece, where the shadows stretched long and the night seemed endless, forbidden rituals persisted. Not because they were accepted, but because they spoke to the darker desires of the human heart. They were acts of desperation, of defiance, of longing for control in a world governed by forces far greater than oneself. They were warnings, whispered about in hushed tones, not just for what they entailed, but for what they revealed about the fragile, trembling line between reverence and rebellion. The moon hung low over the forest, casting a pale, eerie glow that turned every shadow into a whisper, every rustling leaf into a secret. Somewhere in the darkness, a circle of women stood cloaked in silence, their faces obscured by hoods and their hands clasped around a knife that gleamed like silver fire. At their feet, the ground had been carefully swept and marked with sigils, their shapes twisting and curving in ways that seemed to hum with a strange, forbidden energy. The air itself felt alive, thick with an electricity that set every nerve on edge, as if the very world was holding its breath. Hecate. Her name was not spoken lightly, even in daylight, where her power seemed more distant, almost tolerable. But under the cloak of night, when her dominion reigned supreme, her name carried weight. It wasn't just a word, it was a summoning, a vibration that seemed to stir the unseen forces lying dormant just beyond the veil of human understanding. To invoke her was to step into the shadows willingly, to offer yourself not just as a worshiper but as a vessel for powers far older and more profound than mortal comprehension. The goddess of magic, crossroads, and ghosts, Hecate was both feared and revered, a figure who stood on the margins of the world and the underworld. Her followers weren't the kind who prayed openly in the grand temples of Athens or Corinth. They gathered in secret, away from prying eyes and judging tongues, and places where the boundaries between this world and the next felt thin. Forest clearings, abandoned ruins, and desolate seashores became their sanctuaries, spaces where they could call upon Hecate without fear of interruption or condemnation. The rituals performed in her honor were as enigmatic as the goddess herself. They often began with offerings left at crossroads, places where paths intersected and choices were made. These offerings were not the bread or wine so common in Greek religious practices. They were darker, more visceral, animal bones, blood, and even the hair of the supplicant, each item carefully chosen for its symbolic weight. The crossroads were believed to be a liminal space, a doorway between realms, and it was here that her presence was said to be strongest. For those brave, or desperate, enough to call upon Hecate, the stakes were high. Her power was not freely given, and her favor was not easily won. The chants, spoken in low, rhythmic tones, carried the weight of centuries, their syllables sharp and guttural, each word imbued with intention. The air would grow heavy as the ritual unfolded, the flames of nearby torches flickering unnaturally as if responding to an unseen force. And then, in the silence that followed, her presence would be felt, not seen, not heard, but felt, like a chill that started at the base of the spine and spread outward. Her followers believed that she held the keys to all doors, literal and metaphorical, and that she could grant access to hidden knowledge, forbidden power, and the spirits of the dead. Necromancy, a practice already shrouded in fear and taboo, was closely tied to her worship. It was said that her devotees could summon the spirits of the departed, not just to speak with them, but to command them, to bend their will for purposes that ranged from the desperate to the malevolent. But there was a price. There was always a price. Hecate's blessings were not given without cost, and those who sought her aid often found themselves bound to her in ways they hadn't anticipated. The line between supplicant and servant blurred, and many who walked that path never truly returned to the light. Whispers of curses, madness, and untimely deaths followed her followers like shadows, adding to the aura of fear that surrounded her cult. The rituals dedicated to Hecate often involved the use of herbs and potions, substances believed to hold magical properties. Mandrake root, hemlock, and belladonna were among the most common, their preparation and use shrouded in secrecy. The mixing of these ingredients required skill and precision, as a single misstep could lead to disastrous consequences. These potions were not for healing but for power, to induce visions, to bend wills, to strike down enemies with sickness or despair. Fire was another key element in her worship, symbolizing both destruction and transformation. Bonfires were lit during certain rituals, their flames leaping high into the night sky, casting shadows that seemed to dance with a life of their own. Devotees would pass through the smoke, believing it cleansed them of impurities and prepared them to receive Hecate's power. In some ceremonies, effigies were burned, figures crafted from straw and clay, representing the fears or desires of the supplicant, offered to the flames as a form of symbolic release. What set Hecate apart from other deities was her association with the outcast and the liminal. She was a goddess for those who had no place in the structured hierarchy of Greek society, women accused of witchcraft, travelers seeking guidance, mourners unable to let go of their dead. Her cult was a refuge for the marginalized, a space where the rules of the larger world held less sway. But this inclusivity came at a cost. To align oneself with Hecate was to accept the burden of her power, to walk a path that was as isolating as it was enlightening. Even within the context of ancient Greek religion, her cult was viewed with suspicion. The secrecy of her rites, combined with the unsettling nature of her domain, made her followers targets of fear and mistrust. Accusations of witchcraft and dark sorcery were common, and many who practiced her rituals did so in constant fear of discovery. Yet despite this, or perhaps because of it, her worship persisted, a testament to the allure of her power and the desperation of those who sought her aid. Standing at the crossroads, beneath the gaze of the moon, her followers felt the weight of her presence, the pull of her power. They were not heroes or priests, not kings or philosophers. They were seekers, drawn by the promise of answers that could not be found in the daylight. And in that moment, as the night stretched on and the flames flickered in the darkness, they became something more than mortal. They became hers. The torches cast wild, flickering shadows against the ancient stone walls, their flames seeming to pulse in rhythm with the hypnotic beat of the drums. The air was thick with the scent of crushed grapes and sweat, a heady mix that wrapped itself around everyone gathered in the hidden grove. Eyes glistened with anticipation, some shining with reverence, others with something closer to fear. A figure emerged, cloaked in flowing robes, their face obscured by a mask that gleamed like polished bronze. With a slow, deliberate motion, they raised a cup of wine high above their head, a silent invitation to abandon the mundane and step into the extraordinary. This was no ordinary gathering. It was a moment where the lines between reality and divinity blurred, where mortal bodies sought to transcend their earthly bounds and touch something raw, primal, and infinite. The Dionysian mysteries were not for the faint of heart. They were a plunge into chaos, a surrender to ecstasy that left participants changed in ways they could never have imagined. Dionysus, the god of wine, revelry, and transformation, demanded nothing less than total immersion, a willingness to lose oneself completely in the pursuit of liberation. The rites began with the wine, poured generously into cups that never seemed to empty. This was no ordinary drink but a sacred elixir, believed to hold the essence of Dionysus himself. As it passed from hand to hand, the participants drank deeply, their lips stained crimson, their movements growing looser, freer, wilder. The wine was more than a drink, it was a key, unlocking doors within them that they didn't even know existed. The music began softly, a haunting melody played on flutes and lyres, its notes winding through the grove like a whispered secret. But soon, the tempo quickened, the drums joining in with a relentless, pounding rhythm that matched the racing of their hearts. Feet stomped against the ground, arms rose and fell in unison, and voices erupted into song, wordless, soaring cries that seemed to reach for the heavens. It was a sound that could not be contained, bursting forth like a river breaking through a dam, sweeping away everything in its path. As the frenzy took hold, the masks came into play. Each participant donned one, their features replaced by the faces of gods, satyrs, and wild beasts. The masks were more than disguises, they were a transformation, a shedding of the self. Behind those painted visages, they were no longer farmers, artisans, or merchants. They became something ancient, something untamed. They howled like wolves, danced like flames, and laughed like children, their inhibitions falling away as they gave themselves over to the gods' chaotic embrace. The dances grew more frenzied, their movements unrestrained and almost violent, as if the very earth beneath them was alive and pulling them closer. Arms locked, bodies swayed, and the circle tightened, spinning faster and faster until it seemed they might lift off the ground altogether. Some fell to their knees, overcome by fits of uncontrollable laughter or tears, their faces tilted skyward as if they were seeing something no one else could. Others threw their heads back and screamed, their voices raw with a mix of agony and joy, their cries echoing through the night like a chorus of lost and found souls. And then came the moment of transformation. It was not always the same, and it was not something anyone could predict or control. For some, it came as a vision, a fleeting glimpse of Dionysus himself, his eyes burning with a light that was both terrifying and comforting. For others, it was a sensation, a feeling of being lifted out of their bodies and carried into a realm where time and space ceased to exist. There were whispers of those who had seen themselves reflected in the gods' eyes, their mortal forms dissolving into pure energy, their souls dancing alongside him in an eternal, divine frenzy. But the transformation was not always gentle. There were those who emerged from the rites trembling, their hands clutching at invisible wounds, their eyes filled with a haunted knowledge. They had touched something vast and unyielding, something that cared nothing for the fragile boundaries of human understanding. They had been broken open, their souls laid bare, and in the aftermath, they were left to rebuild themselves from the shattered pieces. The rituals were not without their risks. Stories abounded of those who had gone too far, who had surrendered too completely and could not find their way back. They wandered the forests like ghosts, their eyes vacant, their minds trapped in the ecstasy that had consumed them. To lose oneself in Dionysus was to risk never returning, to be forever caught in the throes of a divine madness that defied reason. Yet, for those who survived, the experience was unlike anything else. They emerged from the grove changed, stronger, freer, more alive than they had ever been. They spoke of a fire that burned within them, a light that could not be extinguished. They had faced the chaos and come out the other side, their spirits tempered like steel in a forge. They were not just followers of Dionysus, they were his vessels, his living proof that even in the wildest, darkest corners of existence, there was beauty and power to be found. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, the grove fell silent once more. The torches were extinguished, the masts removed, and the participants began their slow, quiet return to the lives they had momentarily left behind. But they carried something with them, an ember of the gods' presence, a reminder that beneath the layers of order and routine, there was a wild, untamed spirit that could never be fully contained. And for those who had truly felt his touch, that was enough. The room felt as if it had a pulse of its own, a slow, unsettling rhythm that thrummed in time with the collective breath of those gathered. A brazier in the center cast erratic, dancing shadows that twisted along the cracked stone walls. The air was dense, carrying the acrid scent of burning herbs and something metallic, almost like blood. No one spoke, yet the tension was deafening. It was as though they stood at the edge of an unseen storm, waiting for it to consume them. In the dim light, a single figure stepped forward, draped in tattered black cloth that fluttered as though moved by a wind no one else could feel. Their voice cut through the silence, a low, rasping chant that sent shivers through the spines of those who listened. The words were not meant to comfort, they were jagged, harsh, like shards of glass tumbling through the air. It was a summons, calling on the goddess who thrived in chaos, discord, and upheaval. This was not a plea for peace, but a cry for disruption. They were calling on Eris, the goddess of chaos. The rituals dedicated to her were unlike any other. There was no order, no sense of structure or predictability. That was the point. To honor Eris was to embrace the broken, the unpredictable, the unruly forces that tore through life like a gale. Her worshippers sought her favor not through careful offerings, but through acts of rebellion, acts that shattered the delicate balance of the world around them. At the heart of the ritual was the golden apple, a symbol of her most infamous deed. It was said that she had once cast such an apple into the midst of a feast, inscribed with the words "to the fairest." The ensuing chaos among the gods led to the Trojan War, a conflict that altered the course of history. To invoke her, the worshippers crafted their own apples, golden spheres etched with words of provocation, phrases meant to ignite conflict, to disrupt harmony. These apples were not offered at an altar but hurled into the crowd, each person catching one and reading its inscription aloud. The words varied, but the effect was always the same. Faces twisted in anger, laughter rang out with cruel undertones, and the fragile unity of the group splintered into shards. Some rituals involved mirrors, large, fractured pieces that reflected distorted images back at those who gazed into them. Participants were made to look deeply, confronting versions of themselves they might not have wanted to see. In those mirrors, they saw their own flaws magnified, their hidden desires laid bare. Tears often followed, along with screams, curses, and laughter that teetered on the edge of hysteria. It was as though Eris herself whispered from the glass, peeling away the masks they wore and exposing the raw, unfiltered truth beneath. The climax of the ritual came with a cacophony of noise, a wild, discordant symphony created by banging drums, clashing metal, and unhinged voices shouting into the void. It was chaos incarnate, a sound that rattled the bones and left hearts pounding with an almost unbearable intensity. Yet, within that noise, there was a strange kind of freedom. The participants were no longer individuals but fragments of a storm, their identities dissolving into the raw energy of chaos itself. Eris did not demand blood, yet her rites were not without pain. Some cut their palms, letting the blood drip onto the stones below as a symbol of life's constant friction, sharp, messy, and uncontainable. Others burned their offerings, watching as flames consumed paper inscribed with their deepest fears, their darkest desires. The smoke curled upward like a snake, carrying their words into the unknown, into the chaotic embrace of the goddess who thrived on discord. What drew people to such rituals? It wasn't devotion in the traditional sense. It was desperation, a need to confront the chaos within themselves, to break free from the suffocating order of their lives. They came because they were tired of pretending, tired of holding themselves together when everything inside them screamed to fall apart. They came to Eris because she didn't promise answers or comfort. She offered something raw, something honest. She offered chaos. And in that chaos, there was power. Power to destroy but also to rebuild. Power to let go of the illusions they clung to, the lies they told themselves to survive. Power to face the storm and come out the other side, changed but alive. Those who walked away from her rites often bore scars, some visible, others buried deep. But they carried something else too, a piece of her chaos, a spark that refused to be extinguished, no matter how much order the world tried to impose. Eris was not a goddess of easy worship. She did not grant blessings or answer prayers in the way others might. Her gifts were hard, often cruel, but they were real. She reminded her followers that life was not meant to be neat or predictable. It was meant to be lived, raw and unfiltered, with all its jagged edges and chaotic beauty. And as the flames died down and the final echoes of the discordant music faded into silence, the worshippers of Eris stood amidst the wreckage of their ritual, their faces streaked with tears, sweat, and soot. They were shaken, trembling, but also alive in a way they hadn't been before. They had called on chaos, and chaos had answered. And for better or worse, they were forever marked by her touch. The air was cold and damp, heavy with the scent of earth and decay. Shadows clung to the edges of the small clearing, where a circle of figures stood, their faces obscured by hoods. A faint mist swirled at their feet, as if the ground itself exhaled in time with their slow, deliberate breaths. The only light came from a single candle, its flame flickering weakly against the oppressive darkness. No one spoke. They were waiting. A voice finally broke the silence, low and steady, but trembling just enough to betray the weight of what was about to unfold. The leader of the circle raised a hand, fingers wrapped tightly around a blackened staff, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to writhe and twist in the flickering light. The words they spoke were ancient, guttural, as if dredged up from the depths of a forgotten time. Each syllable carried an almost unbearable weight, sinking into the ground and reverberating back through the air. Necromancy was not practiced lightly. To summon the dead was to court the wrath of Hades, the lord of the underworld, whose dominion was not to be disturbed. Yet, there were those desperate enough to risk everything: the grieving, the lost, the cursed. They gathered in secrecy, clutching to the faint hope that the spirits would answer their call and reveal the truths they sought. The ritual required blood, always blood. A small vial was passed around the circle, its contents shimmering darkly. Each participant added their own offering, a crimson drop falling into the vessel. It was said that the dead could not be summoned without a price, and blood was the currency that bridged the gap between the living and the departed. The vial was placed at the center of the circle, alongside a weathered urn filled with ash, and the chant resumed, rising in intensity like the building of a storm. The first sign was the wind. It came suddenly, out of nowhere, whipping through the clearing and snuffing out the candle in an instant. The darkness became complete, oppressive, as if the world had been swallowed whole. Then came the whispers, soft at first, barely audible, but growing louder with each passing moment. They were everywhere and nowhere, 1,000 voices speaking at once, overlapping in a chaotic symphony of sorrow and anger. The participants clutched at their robes, shivering as the air grew colder still. One of them stepped forward, trembling, holding an object wrapped in cloth. Slowly, they unwrapped it, revealing a fragment of bone, bleached white and smooth as glass. It was an anchor, a relic meant to bind the summoned spirit to this world. The leader of the circle took it and held it high, their voice breaking into a commanding tone that sliced through the din of whispers. The ground beneath them began to tremble, a low, rumbling vibration that seemed to come from the very core of the earth. And then, the mist began to rise. It gathered in thick, swirling tendrils, coalescing into a shape that hovered above the ground. Slowly, impossibly, it took form, a figure shrouded in translucent gray, its features indistinct but unmistakably human. Gasps filled the air as the spirit opened its eyes, two faintly glowing orbs that seemed to pierce through flesh and bone. The spirit spoke, its voice echoing with an otherworldly resonance that made the air vibrate. Its words were not of comfort but of warning, laced with the bitterness of one who had been torn from eternal rest. The living had called upon the dead, but the dead demanded answers of their own. Why had they been disturbed? What right did the living have to trespass in the domain of Hades? The tension in the circle was palpable. One of the participants fell to their knees, tears streaming down their face as they begged the spirit for guidance. They wanted to know if their child, taken too soon, was at peace. Another voice interrupted, sharp and urgent, demanding revenge against the one who had wronged them. The spirit turned its gaze to each in turn, silent, judgmental. It was not here to grant wishes or offer solace. It was here because it had been forced to come. The leader of the circle stepped forward again, their voice steady despite the chaos around them. They spoke words of supplication, promising to release the spirit once it had shared its truth. The spirit hesitated, its form flickering like a flame caught in the wind. Then, slowly, it began to speak. The truths it shared were neither gentle nor easy. They were brutal, raw, cutting through the air like shards of ice. The participants listened in silence, their faces pale and drawn, as the spirit laid bare the secrets they had dared to seek. The ritual ended as abruptly as it began. The spirit dissolved into the mist, its final words hanging in the air like a curse. The candle's flame reignited on its own, casting a dim light over the shaken figures who remained. They were changed, haunted. The truths they had sought now weighed heavily on their shoulders, and the price they had paid felt greater than they had ever imagined. As they gathered their belongings and prepared to leave, the ground beneath the circle seemed darker, as if it bore the stain of what had transpired. The leader of the circle knelt down and pressed their palm to the earth, murmuring a prayer to Hades, a plea for forgiveness. They knew that the Lord of the underworld did not take kindly to trespassers, and they could only hope that their offering had been enough to appease him. As the group dispersed into the night, the air around them remained heavy, charged with an energy that refused to dissipate. The whispers of the dead lingered in their ears, a reminder that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. There was a hush in the temple, a silence thick with anticipation. The flickering light from countless candles cast long shadows across the ancient stone walls, their flames trembling in the still air. The high priestess, robed in silk that shimmered like starlight, stood at the center of the sacred altar, her breath shallow and measured. Her eyes were closed, her fingers tracing the outline of an object hidden beneath her robes. It was a symbol, ancient, powerful, forbidden. Around her, a circle of followers gathered, faces hidden in the dark, eyes gleaming with a strange, restless hunger. They knew the ritual about to unfold was not one spoken of openly. It was a secret, passed down through whispered prayers and veiled glances. And yet, tonight, it would be performed. Tonight, Aphrodite's shadow would stretch its dark wings across the temple, and those who dared to seek her blessings would pay the price. The goddess of love was worshipped in many forms, her beauty and grace celebrated in every corner of the world. But there was another side to Aphrodite, one that few dared to acknowledge. Her love was not just sweet, it was fierce, wild, uncontainable. It could ignite souls with desire, but it could also consume them entirely. In the quiet, hidden corners of the world, there were those who understood this. They saw Aphrodite not just as a goddess of love, but as a powerful force of passion, an untamed storm that could both create and destroy. The high priestess took a deep breath, her fingers brushing the sacred object beneath her robes. Slowly, she revealed it to the circle, a silver chalice, delicate and intricate, its surface covered in symbols that seemed to pulse with life. As she held it up, the air seemed to thicken, vibrating with an energy that was both seductive and dangerous. This chalice was said to hold the power of Aphrodite herself, capable of awakening desires too intense, too wild for the uninitiated. It was not meant for public worship, for those who sought her in this way risked more than just their bodies. They risked their souls. The ritual began with soft, lilting chants, the words flowing from the high priestess's lips like a sweet melody, but there was an edge to them, an undercurrent of something darker. The followers closed their eyes, lost in the rhythm of her voice, as if they were being pulled into the very heart of Aphrodite's shadow. The temple, once still, now hummed with an electric charge, the air thickening with the scent of incense and something else, something intoxicating, something that made the blood race and the heart beat faster. As the ritual unfolded, the high priestess dipped her fingers into the chalice, then pressed them to her lips, a gesture that seemed both sacred and sinful. The others watched, entranced, as the liquid gleamed in the candlelight, its texture, its taste, a secret no one had spoken of for centuries. It was said that those who drank from the chalice would be filled with a passion so intense that they could never return to their old lives. Their hearts would burn with desire, and their souls would be bound to Aphrodite's shadow, forever lost in her embrace. But the ritual was not just about the drink. It was about the body, the flesh, the union of those who were willing to surrender to Aphrodite's will. It was a call to pleasure and pain, a test of devotion that could leave the mind shattered and the body broken. The high priestess's voice rose higher, her movements more fluid, as the followers began to stir, their breathing quickening, their faces flushed. The temple's walls seemed to close in around them, as if the very space was being swallowed by the goddess's power. One by one, the participants stepped forward, drawn by an unseen force, their eyes fixed on the high priestess, who now moved with an almost otherworldly grace. Each person approached the chalice, offering a prayer, a pledge, a confession, whatever was needed to earn Aphrodite's favor. And as they drank from the chalice, their expressions shifted, as if the very essence of love had taken root inside them. Their bodies seemed to come alive, their desires unleashed in a rush of sensation that left them trembling and gasping for air. But not all were able to withstand the intensity. One of the followers, her eyes wide with terror, staggered back, her hands clutching at her chest as if trying to hold herself together. The passion was too much. It was consuming her. The others rushed to her side, but it was too late. She had already crossed the line between worship and madness. In that moment, it was clear, this ritual was not meant for the faint of heart. Aphrodite's shadow was a powerful force, one that demanded total surrender, and those who tried to control it were doomed to be torn apart. The high priestess watched with a mixture of pity and something darker as the woman fell to the ground, her body writhing in the aftermath of the ritual. This was the price of seeking the goddess's favor. Aphrodite did not offer love freely, she demanded sacrifice, surrender, a complete unraveling of the self. To worship her in this way was to risk everything, the body, the mind, the soul. And yet, despite the danger, there were always those willing to pay the price. They returned to the temple again and again, seeking the forbidden love that only Aphrodite's shadow could provide. They were the desperate, the broken, the ones who had been touched by love's darkness and yearned for more. The high priestess knew this. She had seen it in their eyes, and the way they came to her with hunger and need. They would not stop. They could not. The ritual ended, and the followers, dazed and disoriented, began to stagger out of the temple, their bodies heavy with the weight of what they had experienced. The high priestess lingered, her eyes locked on the chalice, now empty and abandoned on the altar. She knew what would come next: whispers, rumors, temptations. This was a secret that could never remain hidden for long. The world outside would never understand, and those who sought to worship Aphrodite in this way would always be seen as outcasts, rebels, lost souls. But within the shadows of the temple, in the stillness that followed the ritual, there was something more. A promise. A dangerous, irresistible promise that Aphrodite's love, in all its forms, could heal and destroy in equal measure. The price of devotion was steep, but those who sought her favor, those who truly understood her shadow, would never look back. They would never be the same. The air in the underground chamber was thick, suffocating, as though it held the weight of centuries. Torches flickered weakly on the stone walls, casting long, twisting shadows that danced like ghosts. The smell of damp earth and something older, something far more ancient, seeped into the bones of those who entered. Every breath felt like a prayer, a desperate plea to the gods who resided in the dark corners of the world. Tonight, they would be remembered. Tonight, an offering would be made. In the center of the chamber, an altar stood, rough-hewn, ancient, worn smooth by countless hands that had touched it in fear, in reverence, and sacrifice. Around it, the gathered crowd stood silent, their faces hidden in the half-light, eyes wide with a mixture of awe and dread. The ritual had begun, and there was no turning back. The gods they were honoring were not of the heavens, shining with light and warmth. These were the deities of the underworld, the chthonic gods, whose names were whispered in hushed tones, whose very presence was felt as a cold draft in the bones. Hades, Persephone, Demeter in her dark aspect, gods who ruled over the dead, who reigned in the unseen places beneath the earth. They were not gods to be called upon lightly, for their favors came at a cost. And that cost, tonight, would be paid in blood. The high priestess stepped forward, her robes flowing like liquid shadows, her face a mask of calm. In her hands, she held a knife, small, sharp, gleaming coldly in the dim light. It was not a tool of violence, but of ritual, a means to open the veil between the living and the dead. The crowd watched as she approached the altar, the heavy silence broken only by the sound of her footsteps, slow and deliberate. She raised the knife, the weight of it pressing down on her like the gaze of the gods themselves. The blade caught the light for just a moment before it was lowered, pointing toward the stone. The offering would be made. There would be no turning back. It was then that the smell of earth grew stronger, damp and musty, as if the very ground beneath them was stirring in response to the ancient rite. The priestess's voice broke through the stillness, a chant, soft at first, barely more than a whisper. But it grew louder, filling the space with an energy that thrummed in the chest. The words were foreign, the meaning lost to time, but they were not meant to be understood. They were meant to summon, to call out to the gods who waited in the darkness, to remind them that they were not forgotten. The ground seemed to shift, the air growing heavier, colder. For a moment, the world felt suspended in time, as if everything was holding its breath. And then the altar was moved, the stone shifting with a low, grinding noise that sent chills down the spines of all who stood near. The sacrifice was ready. A figure stepped forward, cloaked in shadows, face hidden. It was not a voluntary offering. This was no simple prayer or gift. The figure was bound, tied to the altar as though by fate itself. The ritual demanded it. The sacrifice was not a choice, it was a necessity. The crowd held their breath as the figure was gently laid upon the stone, their body trembling in fear and anticipation. The high priestess knelt beside them, her hands trembling for the first time that night as she raised the knife again. The chant grew louder, the words more insistent, calling to the chthonic gods, begging for their favor. The gods who ruled over death, who lived in the darkness of the earth, whose power was felt not in the beauty of life, but in the stillness of decay. With a single, fluid motion, the knife descended. The figure's gasp echoed in the chamber, but it was swallowed quickly by the chanting, by the growing hum of energy that vibrated through the stone. Blood pooled on the altar, a dark offering to the gods who ruled over the dead. It was not just the life that was offered, but the spirit, the soul, everything that made a person whole was given, in exchange for the favor of the gods. And as the blood flowed, the air grew colder still, the shadows deeper. The walls seemed to close in, pressing tighter against the gathered crowd. There was no escape. No way to turn back. The gods had been summoned, and their will would be done. The high priestess stood back, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she watched the blood slowly seep into the stone. The sacrifice was complete, but the ritual was not yet over. She raised her arms, her eyes closed, as if listening for something. The room seemed to hold its breath as the world outside fell away. Time no longer mattered in this place, only the presence of the gods remained. And then, the ground trembled. A low rumble, deep beneath the earth, shook the chamber. The torches flickered violently, casting erratic shadows across the walls. It was as though the gods themselves were stirring, waking from their ancient slumber. The blood on the altar began to move, swirling in patterns that defied reason, drawing closer to the center of the stone. For a moment, there was silence. Complete, absolute silence. And then, a whisper, soft, like a breath against the ear, but impossibly loud in the stillness. The gods had spoken. The high priestess lowered her arms, her face a mask of satisfaction. The offering had been accepted. The favor had been granted. There was no need for words. The ritual had been completed, and the gods of the underworld would be pleased. They had been remembered, and their power would flow freely once more. But the cost was always the same. The air was thick with it, the weight of the blood, the sacrifice, the price paid for favor. The dead had been honored, but those who remained in the world of the living would never forget the price that had been paid. For the gods of the underworld demanded nothing less than everything. As the chamber grew still, the shadows once again began to dance, and the air settled back into a thick, suffocating silence. The ritual was over, but its weight lingered. The gods had been fed, and now the earth would remember. The wind howled through the ruins, carrying with it the weight of centuries. Stone walls, cracked and broken, stood as silent witnesses to what had transpired here long ago. Beneath the earth, in the forgotten corners of the world, lies the haunting reminder of a practice too terrifying to believe, yet too real to ignore. Human sacrifice. A rite as ancient as humanity itself, a practice that stirs the deepest fears and questions that have been passed down through generations. Was it myth, or was it something much darker? The remains of an altar, worn by time, stand in the center of the excavation site, its surface stained with the remnants of long-forgotten rituals. Around it, a team of archaeologists work, their hands trembling not from the cold, but from the weight of what they are about to uncover. Some say it is just superstition, stories told by ancient scribes to instill fear in those who dare venture too close to the truth. But as the soil is peeled back, layer by layer, the bones tell a different story. Among the broken pottery and shattered stone, something more chilling is found, a human skull, its features still discernible despite the ravages of time. The archaeologists exchange nervous glances. They know what this means. They know that the stories, the myths, they might just be real. The sound of metal scraping against stone echoes through the site as the team carefully extracts the ancient remains. Each motion is slow, deliberate, as if even the smallest disruption could release something long buried. The discovery is both shocking and undeniable. The bones are not just remnants of an ancient civilization, they are the remnants of a human life. A life that was taken as part of something far greater than personal sacrifice. A life given, perhaps unwillingly, to appease gods or powers that had no mercy. The debate over human sacrifice has raged for centuries. Some say it was done for the gods, to ensure good harvests, to bring peace in times of war, to bring balance to a world out of control. Others argue that it was an act of fear, driven by the belief that without such offerings, the gods would bring wrath and destruction. The truth lies somewhere in between, a mixture of belief, desperation, and a twisted need for control. Yet, despite the archaeological evidence, some still dismiss the practice as myth, too horrific to be anything but a legend. And still, the bones remain, telling their own story. Each crack in the skull, each fracture in the bone, speaks of a moment long ago, a life cut short. How many others had met the same fate? How many were sacrificed in the name of power, religion, or a belief in a better tomorrow? How many never had a chance to say goodbye, to live out their days in peace? As the archaeologists continue their work, the unease grows. The further they dig, the more they uncover. The ritualistic nature of the bones suggests something far darker than mere burial. The skull has been placed carefully, as if positioned with great purpose. Some of the bones are marked with symbols, perhaps those of a god long forgotten. Were these the remains of an offering, a life willingly given in exchange for something in return? Or were they the result of something more sinister, a life taken without consent, without compassion? The debate becomes more than academic. It becomes personal. One archaeologist, her hands trembling as she holds the bone fragments, feels the weight of the discovery in her chest. It is one thing to read about human sacrifice in books, to hear about it from the mouths of historians and storytellers. It is another thing entirely to hold it in your hands, to know that someone, once alive, was subjected to such an unimaginable fate. The bones are not just remnants of a lost world. They are a testament to the power of belief and the lengths to which people will go to appease forces beyond their control. And yet, there is a lingering question that haunts every corner of the excavation site. Were the people who took part in these sacrifices aware of the weight of their actions? Did they understand the price they were asking others to pay? Or were they, too, victims of their own faith? A shiver runs down the archaeologist's spine as the sun begins to set, casting a shadow over the ruins. The sight grows darker, the temperature dropping as the memories of what happened here stir in the air. The bones, now uncovered in their entirety, seem to breathe. They speak, in a language older than time itself. They whisper of a past that cannot be forgotten, of lives that were extinguished in the name of gods who demanded everything. With each passing day, the excavation uncovers more. But the deeper they go, the less they understand. The myths become more real, more tangible. And the horror of it all settles like a weight upon their hearts. What they thought were just stories, just whispered fears, are now undeniable truths. The past cannot be undone, no matter how much they may wish it. As night falls, the team gathers around a campfire, trying to shake off the unease that has settled over them. But the weight of the discovery hangs in the air, suffocating. There is no escaping the reality that they have uncovered. The bones tell their own story, and it is not one easily forgotten. In the silence, one archaeologist speaks up, her voice barely above a whisper. What if it wasn't just about belief? What if it was about control? Power over life and death? The others sit in stunned silence, the fire crackling in the background. The question lingers, unanswered. The discovery of these bones forces them to confront a terrifying truth, that some things, no matter how unbelievable, are too real to ignore. And the past, no matter how far buried, always has a way of resurfacing. The rituals may have been lost to time, but their echoes continue to haunt the present. And as the fire burns low, the question remains, how many more secrets lie beneath the earth, waiting to be uncovered? How many more lives were lost in the name of sacrifice, of gods whose demands could never be sated? The bones tell the story, but it is a story that refuses to let go, a story that will not be silenced. The cold weight of the lead tablet sat heavy in her hands, its surface etched with sharp, deliberate scratches. The words carved into the metal were jagged and raw, filled with a venom that seemed to pulse through the centuries. Each letter carried a whisper, a desperate plea wrapped in malice. The air around her felt thick, charged with something unseen but unmistakable, an energy that clung to her skin and made her heart race. It was not an ordinary artifact. These were not words meant to inspire or uplift. They were dark prayers, inscribed by hands trembling with hatred or despair, seeking vengeance in a world where justice felt elusive. Beneath the weight of the tablet lay the unspoken stories of those who believed that their suffering could only be balanced by another's misfortune. The room felt colder as she read the inscriptions aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. Bind his hands, his feet, his tongue. Let his sleep be restless, his days filled with torment. The words tasted bitter in her mouth, yet they were impossible to ignore. The curses were direct, cutting, unrelenting. Each phrase carried the weight of a broken heart, a betrayed trust, a deep and festering wound. These were not casual writings. They were born of nights spent in anguish, of souls who had knelt before the unknown with their tablets in hand, pouring their pain into every line. The act of carving the words was both deliberate and desperate, a ritual steeped in emotion. The inscriptions were often accompanied by the name of a god or spirit, called upon to act as an intermediary, a deliverer of justice or punishment. The process was intimate. The writer would pour their pain into the metal, every stroke of the stylus an act of release and determination. The tablets were then folded, hidden away in places believed to hold power, beneath the floors of temples, in graves, or dropped into wells. The goal was clear: to reach the unseen forces that governed the balance of fortune and misfortune. To send their dark prayer into the void, hoping it would be answered. She closed her eyes and could almost hear them, those ancient voices, heavy with desperation. A woman betrayed by her lover, her curse aimed at the one who had stolen his affection. A merchant ruined by deceit, wishing ill upon his rival. A grieving mother, her curse sharper than a blade, demanding retribution for the loss of her child. Each story was unique, yet they all shared one thing: the belief that justice could only be achieved through vengeance. There was no forgiveness in these prayers. They were not requests for reconciliation or understanding. They were raw, filled with a desire to see harm done. Some called for sickness, others for sleepless nights, others still for death. The words were brutal, yet they revealed a deep vulnerability. For beneath the malice lay the wounded soul of someone who had suffered, someone who felt powerless to act in any other way. The archaeologists had uncovered dozens of these tablets, each one a testament to human emotion at its most extreme. Some were written with meticulous care, the letters precise and orderly. Others were rushed, the lines uneven and jagged, as if carved in a fit of rage or panic. The handwriting was different, but the tone was always the same, pleas wrapped in fury. The power of the cursed tablets didn't just lie in their words, but in the ritual surrounding them. The act of creating the tablet was an offering in itself, a moment of connection between the mortal and the divine, or perhaps the infernal. Many believed that the spirits of the underworld would be the ones to carry out their wishes. The dead, after all, were thought to hold sway over the living, their unseen hands capable of twisting fate. She couldn't help but wonder what it must have felt like to inscribe those words. To sit in the dim light of a flickering lamp, the metal tablet before you, the stylus in your hand. To feel the weight of your anger or heartbreak with every stroke. To know that you were calling upon forces you couldn't fully understand, forces that might not even exist. And yet, to still believe enough to try. The intensity of the curses varied. Some were direct, commanding the spirits to act swiftly and decisively. Others were more elaborate, detailing the harm to befall their target with poetic precision. A curse against a thief might call for their hands to wither. A curse against an unfaithful lover might demand they be struck blind, unable to see beauty again. The specificity was chilling, the emotions raw and unfiltered. As she turned the tablet over in her hands, she noticed a faint outline, a human figure, crudely etched into the metal. It was common for the curses to include such imagery, a representation of the intended victim. The figure was often bound or pierced with nails, a visual symbol of the harm wished upon them. The artistry, if it could be called that, was crude but effective. It left no doubt about the writer's intent. The room seemed to grow darker, the shadows deepening as she placed the tablet back among the others. The collection felt alive, charged with the emotions of those who had created them. It was impossible to ignore the humanity behind the curses, the pain, the longing for justice, the belief that harm could be balanced by harm. These were not just objects. They were windows into the hearts of those who had lived long ago, their emotions as vivid and real as if they had been written yesterday. She found herself haunted by one curse in particular, its words burned into her mind. May he wander forever, without rest, without peace. May he find no home, no comfort, no love. The simplicity of it made it all the more chilling. It wasn't just a curse. It was a declaration of pain so profound that it could only be expressed through the wish for another's suffering. The curse tablets were more than just artifacts. They were a reminder of the darker side of human nature, of the lengths people will go to when they feel powerless and wronged. They spoke of a world where vengeance was sought not through words or actions, but through the unseen forces of the universe. And in those moments, as she stood among the tablets, she felt the weight of their pain, their anger, their hope for a justice that could never truly be fulfilled. The air hung heavy with the scent of burning herbs, a thick, acrid smoke curling into the twilight. A lone figure stood at the edge of the burial ground, their silhouette sharp against the fading light. In their hands, they held a vessel, its surface darkened by years of use. The faint murmurs of a chant escaped their lips, barely audible but pulsing with an eerie rhythm that made the skin crawl. This was no ordinary funeral. The earth at their feet was not yet cold. The soil, freshly turned, seemed alive in its unsettled state. Beneath it lay the body, wrapped tightly in cloth, the folds hiding more than flesh. But this burial carried more than the weight of grief, it carried intent. The mourners were gone, their prayers long since faded into the evening. What remained was the forbidden, rituals whispered of but never openly acknowledged. There were those who sought to honor their dead in ways the world shunned. The usual rites of cleansing and parting were not enough for them. They wanted connection, a bond that would defy the finality of death. They called upon practices forbidden by law or condemned by faith, their desperation driving them to acts both tender and terrifying. The vessel in the figure's hands began to tremble, whether from their grip or something more, it was impossible to tell. A liquid, thick and dark, poured from its lip, seeping into the soil above the grave. The chant grew louder, its rhythm steady but strained, as though pulling at something unseen. It wasn't just a gesture, it was a plea, a calling to the departed to linger a little longer, to grant their presence to the living. Stories spoke of funerals where the dead were not laid to rest but invited to remain. Objects imbued with their essence, locks of hair, personal items, even fragments of bone, were taken from the grave and kept in secret. These tokens became bridges between the worlds, portals through which the living might seek guidance, solace, or even revenge. Some called it devotion, others desecration. There were also tales of manipulation, acts that turned love into something twisted. A grieving widow might sprinkle ash from her husband's pyre into her wine, drinking it in the hope that his strength would flow through her veins. A parent, desperate to protect a child's memory, might bury a piece of their soul in a hidden place, binding them forever to the land they had once walked. These rituals were acts of defiance, but also acts of profound sorrow, their origins rooted in the unbearable weight of loss. The figure knelt, pressing their palms against the earth, whispering words now sharp and urgent. Their voice cracked, carrying an edge of fear. What they sought was not peace for the dead but power, an energy that could be harnessed, shaped, wielded. The boundary between honor and exploitation blurred in that moment, the soil beneath their hands trembling with a force both ancient and unholy. Funeral rites were meant to guide the dead, to offer them a path forward. But these rites called them back, bound them to the world they had left. Some spoke of the dead rising in anger, their rest disturbed by selfish demands. Others whispered of spirits lingering willingly, their love too strong to let them go. Yet, what lingered most in the air was the question, could the living truly honor the dead by chaining them to their own despair? The rituals often took place in shadows, under moonlight, in forests, or hidden chambers far from prying eyes. The participants rarely spoke of their actions, knowing full well the judgment that would follow. But the silence around these rites was deafening, amplifying their mystery and power. The stories that did escape were chilling, told in hushed tones by those who claimed to have seen too much. There was the tale of a grieving father who refused to let his son's soul rest. He buried the boy with a mirror, hoping to trap his spirit within its glassy depths. Every night, he would sit by the grave, staring into the mirror, waiting for the boy's reflection to appear. They said he did see it, but only once, and that what stared back was not his son, but something darker, something angry. The mirror was later found shattered, its shards scattered like whispers of a warning. Another story spoke of a woman who wore a necklace made from the teeth of her deceased lover, believing it would keep him close to her heart. She claimed she could hear his voice in her dreams, his whispers guiding her through life. But those who knew her said the whispers grew darker over time, urging her to acts she would never have considered in life. The necklace was eventually buried with her when she passed, its power sealed beneath layers of earth. Not all rituals were born of love or grief. Some were acts of spite, meant to curse the dead rather than honor them. Enemies were buried with symbols of mockery, their graves surrounded by objects designed to torment their spirits. It was said that the vengeful dead would wander, unable to find peace, their energy feeding the bitterness of those who had wronged them. These acts carried a darkness that lingered long after the participants were gone, their consequences rippling through time. The figure's chant faltered, their breath catching as the ground beneath them seemed to shift. For a moment, there was silence, a pause so profound it seemed to swallow the world. Then, a sound, a low, guttural noise that rose from the earth, neither human nor natural. The figure recoiled, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror. Whatever they had called upon had answered, but at what cost? The forbidden rites of death were acts of courage and desperation, of love and defiance. They were whispers in the dark, filled with hope and fear, beauty and horror. They carried the weight of humanity's greatest pain, the loss of those we cannot bear to lose. And in their forbidden nature lay a truth as old as time, that grief, in all its forms, will always seek a way to speak. The fire flickered with a strange, hypnotic rhythm, casting shadows that danced on the faces of those gathered. The air carried an unearthly tension, the kind that tightened the chest and made the skin crawl. The central figure stood, their expression calm, but their voice trembling with something unspoken. Before them was a feast unlike any other, shrouded in mystery and unease. This was no celebration. This was something darker, something whispered about only in the safety of daylight, a ritual steeped in legend, feared for its sinister intimacy. The stories often began with famine, the kind of hunger that gnawed at the soul as much as the body. In desperate times, when the crops failed and the earth offered no solace, people turned to their most primal instincts. Tales spoke of sacred ceremonies where human flesh was not just sustenance but a bridge, a way to absorb the strength, wisdom, or even spirit of the consumed. It wasn't mere survival, it was a transaction, a belief that life could transcend its limits if only one dared to partake. Legends told of kings who demanded such rituals, their power tied to the blood of their enemies. Warriors, their bodies broken in battle, became offerings to their victors. The flesh was roasted on open flames, and the act was as much a declaration of dominance as it was a plea to the gods for continued strength. To consume another was to claim their essence, to make their bravery, cunning, or even hatred a part of one's own being. The myth of Tantalus was often whispered in hushed tones, a tale of betrayal that left a bitter taste long after it was told. In his arrogance, Tantalus served the gods a feast made from his own son, testing their divine omniscience. The gods, horrified yet undeterred, punished him with eternal hunger and thirst, a reminder that some lines, even in mythology, should never be crossed. Yet, the act itself lingered in the imagination, a grotesque blend of desperation and audacity. Not all tales painted the act as punishment. Some carried a strange reverence, portraying it as an ultimate sacrifice. In one story, a great leader lay dying, his body ravaged by illness. His followers, unable to bear the thought of losing him, performed a ritual that was both horrifying and poignant. They consumed his flesh, believing it would allow his spirit to live within them, guiding their steps even after his death. It was an act of devotion that blurred the lines between love and monstrosity, leaving those who heard the tale unsettled by its paradox. Among the most chilling stories were those where the ritual was performed not out of necessity but as a path to power. Witches, it was said, would consume the hearts of their victims to steal their vitality or bind their spirits. In some legends, those who partook in such feasts claimed to hear whispers in the night, the voices of those they had consumed, their presence lingering like an unwanted shadow. The power gained was undeniable, but it came at the cost of one's humanity, each bite stripping away a piece of the soul. The feasts were not always voluntary. Some myths spoke of the unwilling, the sacrificial lambs chosen to sustain the community or appease vengeful gods. Bound and silent, they became offerings, their flesh a currency exchanged for rain, fertility, or victory. These stories carried a haunting sorrow, the faces of the sacrificed etched into the memory of those left behind. Their names were rarely spoken, but their absence was felt in every corner of the village, a void that no amount of prosperity could fill. One tale described a village cursed with endless drought. The elders, desperate to save their people, turned to the old ways, rites long abandoned and condemned. A young girl, chosen for her purity, was prepared as the offering. Her body, they believed, would appease the gods, her spirit rising with the smoke of the sacred fire. The villagers wept as the ritual began, their grief mingling with the hope that her sacrifice would bring life back to the barren fields. When the rain finally came, it was said to taste of salt, a reminder of the tears shed in her name. The act itself was shrouded in secrecy, performed under the cover of night or in hidden chambers. The participants wore masks, their identities obscured not just from onlookers but from themselves. The mask served as a barrier, a way to distance the person from the act, to make it bearable. Yet, beneath the mask, the eyes told the truth, the fear, the revulsion, the strange, forbidden thrill. Those who participated rarely spoke of it afterward, the weight of the ritual something they carried in silence. In some myths, the consumed fought back, their spirits refusing to rest. They haunted the dreams of those who had feasted upon them, their voices echoing with accusations and anguish. These tales served as warnings, cautioning against the temptation to tamper with the natural order. But even in their horror, there was an undercurrent of fascination, a pull toward the forbidden that humanity could never quite resist. The fire crackled, its light flickering over the gathered faces. The central figure paused, their hand hovering over the offering. The air grew thick with anticipation, each breath a silent plea, for courage, for understanding, for absolution. The act, once begun, could not be undone. It would bind them forever, a mark etched into their souls. Yet, they did not turn away. The flames rose higher, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch into eternity. The room was silent, save for the faint crackle of a dying fire. A woman sat alone, her face illuminated by the flickering light, her eyes clouded with something that was not quite human. In her hands, a small bowl of darkened water shimmered, reflecting shapes that weren't there. The air was heavy with the scent of burning herbs and an unshakable tension. Those who had dared to enter this place before spoke of her voice, a sound that wasn't hers but something ancient and unknowable. When she finally spoke, it was as if the walls themselves listened. The oracle's words were not meant to comfort. They were jagged edges, tearing through the fabric of certainty and leaving those who heard them with more questions than answers. Her prophecies were a double-edged sword, desperately sought but feared for the truths they might hold. She spoke of forbidden futures, paths no one wanted to tread yet felt powerless to avoid. People came to her for guidance, knowing her visions were laced with danger, and yet they could not resist. It was said that her prophecies were never truly her own. The gods, or perhaps something darker, whispered them into her ears, twisting her tongue into shapes no mortal words could take. She was merely the vessel, carrying messages from realms unseen. But even vessels can be tainted. In some tales, the oracles became corrupted, their visions manipulated by those who sought to control fate itself. Kings, desperate to hold their thrones, and priests, seeking power over their flocks, would offer her gifts too tempting to refuse. Gold, jewels, promises of freedom, they all came at a price. The most unsettling stories were those of prophecies that felt wrong from the start. A ruler would visit the oracle, seeking reassurance of victory, only to leave with a message that felt like poison wrapped in silk. "The sun will not rise on your glory," she might say, her voice a chilling monotone. The words were vague, but the weight of them was suffocating. Those who ignored her warnings often met their end in ways that felt preordained, as if the prophecy itself had willed it. But what if the prophecy was a lie? What if the oracle, tired of her chains, spoke not what was foretold, but what she wished to be true? Some whispered of oracles who turned their visions against their oppressors, delivering messages that sowed chaos instead of clarity. A king might execute his most loyal advisor based on her words, only to discover too late that it was a ruse. The line between truth and manipulation blurred, leaving destruction in its wake. There were tales of forbidden prophecies, words that should never have been spoken. One such story spoke of an oracle who foretold the end of her own city. Her voice trembled as she described flames devouring the stone walls, shadows engulfing the streets. Her people turned against her, branding her a traitor for speaking such doom. They silenced her, but the prophecy lingered, seeping into their dreams and haunting their waking hours. When the city fell, just as she had said, the air was thick with smoke and regret. Some believed the oracles could be tricked, their visions clouded by carefully crafted questions. A young warrior once sought an oracle, asking if he would be victorious in battle. "You will triumph, but at a cost," she replied, her voice heavy with sorrow. Emboldened, he marched to war, only to discover that his victory required the lives of those he loved most. He returned, broken and hollow, cursing the oracle for her cruel riddle. But was it truly a riddle, or had he simply asked the wrong question? The rituals surrounding the oracles were as unsettling as their words. People would bring offerings, coins, animals, even locks of their own hair, hoping to sway the vision in their favor. Some spoke of darker sacrifices, blood spilled to ensure the gods' favor. The oracles themselves were often secluded, kept away from the world to preserve their purity, or perhaps to keep their humanity from interfering with their visions. They were treated as both sacred and cursed, revered for their gifts yet feared for what they might reveal. The most chilling stories were those in which the oracle's words seemed to manipulate not just the future but the people themselves. A man seeking guidance might leave feeling as though the prophecy had chosen him, shaping his actions in ways he couldn't understand. "You will betray the one you love most," she might say, and in his desperation to avoid it, he would unwittingly set the betrayal in motion. The prophecy became a self-fulfilling curse, its power lying not in its truth, but in the fear it planted. Even those who didn't believe in the prophecies found themselves unable to escape their pull. A merchant, hearing of a prophecy that spoke of disaster at sea, might cancel his voyage out of caution. But his decision would lead to ruin on land, as his competitors seized the opportunities he left behind. The prophecy, true or not, had reshaped his fate, leaving him to wonder if it was the oracle or his own fears that had sealed his downfall. The oracle herself was often a figure of tragedy. Chosen, perhaps cursed, from birth, she carried the burden of knowledge no one should bear. Her visions were a gift to others, but a torment to herself, each one tearing at her mind like a storm. Some tales spoke of oracles who went mad, their own prophecies haunting them until they could no longer distinguish vision from reality. Others ended their lives, unable to bear the weight of the futures they saw but could not change. Yet, for all their sorrow, the oracles held a power that could not be denied. Their words could topple empires, shatter alliances, and ignite wars. They were both feared and sought after, their presence a reminder of the thin veil between the mortal world and something far more terrifying. And as the fire in the oracle's chamber flickered, her eyes shifted, reflecting not just the light but something far beyond it. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of countless lifetimes, each word a thread in the tapestry of fate. The old man's hands trembled as he arranged the objects before him. A twisted lock of hair, a shard of broken glass, a scrap of parchment covered in uneven writing, all placed with a precision that seemed almost reverent. The room smelled of damp earth and smoke, a suffocating mixture that clung to the walls and to his breath. In the flickering light of a single candle, his shadow danced, larger than life, twisting like something alive. He spoke words too ancient to understand, his voice rising and falling like the wind through a forest of dead trees. Each item in his ritual told a story. The lock of hair had been stolen, plucked from an unsuspecting victim as they walked past him in the market. The glass was from a mirror shattered in anger, its edges still sharp with the memory of betrayal. The parchment bore a name written with trembling hands, ink smudged by hesitation or perhaps regret. Together, they formed a bond, a bridge between the visible world and the unseen forces that hung heavy in the air. He lifted a small bundle, tied tightly with a strip of red cloth. The knot was intricate, more complex than it appeared, and each twist held a purpose. Binding. Containing. Controlling. He whispered as he tied it tighter, words meant to seal the spell and leave no room for escape. It wasn't enough to ask for change, the ritual demanded something more, a token of sacrifice, a price that had to be paid. Binding oaths and casting spells have always carried a weight beyond mere superstition. The objects chosen were never random. They were symbols, extensions of the person or thing being targeted. A strand of hair became the essence of a life. A personal trinket carried the emotions of its owner, their fears and hopes bound into its material. These objects transformed ordinary rituals into something potent, a dangerous blend of intent and belief. In another place, a woman knelt before an altar of stones. Her face was streaked with tears as she held a single feather in her hand. It wasn't an ordinary feather, it had been taken from the raven that nested near her window, a bird she believed carried messages from the other world. The feather was dipped in oil, its dark edges gleaming in the light of the full moon. She muttered words that cracked with emotion, her plea for vengeance sharp and raw. She pressed the feather to her lips, sealing her promise to the forces she had summoned. These spells weren't mere acts of desperation. They were carefully crafted, every word and motion imbued with meaning. People often thought of magic as wild and untamed, but this was something different, rituals as precise as clockwork, each piece fitting together in a way that felt almost mathematical. The objects were tools, but they were also witnesses, bearing silent testimony to the emotions that fueled the spell. The most unsettling rituals were the ones that bound two lives together. The knot, tied with the trembling hands of a hopeful lover or a vengeful rival, was more than just string and fabric. It became a tether, an invisible thread connecting souls. Once tied, the knot could not be undone without consequences. Some spoke of knots that strangled the life out of their targets, their power growing tighter with each passing day. Others told of bonds that couldn't be broken, forcing people to stay connected even when hatred had replaced love. In some stories, the rituals succeeded too well. A man seeking to win the affection of a woman tied a binding knot using her scarf. He whispered her name into the knot, his voice filled with longing. But as the days passed, her affection turned to obsession, a shadow of what he had wished for. She followed him everywhere, her eyes dark with something unrecognizable. He had tied her to him, but it was no longer love that held them together. It was something far more dangerous. Not all rituals were born of anger or desire. Some were desperate attempts to protect, to shield loved ones from harm. A mother might place her child's worn shoes at the edge of a sacred circle, praying for their safety. A farmer might bury a small carved figure in his field, asking for a bountiful harvest. These rituals carried the same weight, the same careful attention to detail. The objects became vessels for hope, for fear, for every emotion too large to be spoken aloud. But hope, like anger, could twist into something unrecognizable. A woman, fearing for her husband's life in war, placed his wedding band into a small jar filled with salt. She sealed it with wax, her voice trembling as she begged for his safe return. When he came back, alive but changed, she wondered if the ritual had worked too well. He seemed distant, his laughter hollow, as if part of him had been left behind on the battlefield. The jar remained on her shelf, untouched but ever present, a silent reminder of the power she had unleashed. The power of these rituals lay not just in the objects, but in the intent behind them. The lock of hair, the feather, the broken glass, they were symbols, yes, but they were also catalysts. They held the weight of the person who used them, their fears, desires, and emotions woven into every fiber. The rituals didn't just change the world, they changed the people who performed them, leaving marks that couldn't always be seen. The old man, now finished with his ritual, placed the bundle into the fire. The red cloth burned slowly, its smoke curling upward like a living thing. He watched in silence, his face unreadable. Somewhere, far beyond the walls of his small room, the echoes of his actions would ripple outward. He didn't know if the spell would work, but he didn't need to. The ritual was complete, and that was enough. The objects had done their part, transforming his whispers into something tangible, something that could no longer be undone. The night sky stretched endlessly, a vast, inky canvas pierced by the cold light of stars. It was more than beautiful, it was alive, whispering secrets that only the bold dared to interpret. In the stillness of the ancient world, when the heavens seemed closer, people would gather under these celestial patterns, hearts heavy with questions. What did it mean when the moon disappeared, swallowed by shadow? Why did certain stars blaze brighter in one season and fade into nothingness in another? Every flicker in the sky was a message, every comet a warning, every alignment of planets a moment pregnant with destiny. A priest stood at the edge of a marble temple, his gaze locked on the heavens. In his hand, he held a bronze tablet, its surface etched with symbols and lines, a map of the stars above him. His fingers trembled slightly, not from fear but from reverence. He knew the power in what he was about to interpret. Above him, a rare conjunction was taking place, the planets Venus and Jupiter almost touching, their light merging into something extraordinary. He murmured a prayer to the gods, asking for clarity, for the strength to bear the burden of knowing what the stars foretold. Astrology wasn't just a practice, it was a language, one that connected the earth to the cosmos. To the Greeks, every celestial event carried a significance that rippled through the mortal world. When the moon turned red during an eclipse, it wasn't just a trick of light, it was the gods spilling their anger into the skies. A shooting star wasn't merely a fleeting beauty, it was a soul crossing the threshold between the living and the dead. Each event demanded attention, interpretation, and, often, action. In a village near the mountains, a mother clutched her newborn son as she watched the night sky. The stars seemed wrong tonight, scattered in unfamiliar patterns that made her stomach churn. She had heard the whispers, a comet had been spotted a week before, its fiery tail streaking across the heavens. Comets were never good omens. They were harbingers of chaos, of kings falling and kingdoms crumbling. She rocked her baby gently, tears streaming down her face as she prayed that the gods would spare her family from whatever disaster the comet promised. For the Greeks, the stars weren't distant, indifferent objects. They were threads in the fabric of existence, and their movements could unravel lives or weave them into greatness. Astrologers, often seen as intermediaries between the divine and the mortal, bore the heavy responsibility of deciphering these celestial messages. They studied the heavens with an intensity that bordered on obsession, mapping the paths of planets, calculating the angles between them, and connecting them to the fates of kings, warriors, and common folk alike. One such astrologer sat in the dim light of his study, surrounded by scrolls and star charts. He had been summoned to interpret a lunar eclipse, one that would occur on the eve of a great battle. The general had demanded to know, would the gods favor his army? The astrologer's calculations led him to an answer, but it wasn't one he wanted to deliver. The eclipse, dark and blood-red, foretold defeat, the kind that would scatter armies and shatter alliances. He hesitated, knowing the weight his words carried. The stars had spoken, but could he bear the burden of their message? The stars didn't just predict events, they shaped rituals. During particularly rare alignments, entire cities would come alive with ceremonies meant to honor or appease the forces at work. On one such night, when the Pleiades cluster rose just before dawn, farmers would light fires in their fields, asking for protection for their crops. Children would wear amulets carved with the symbols of the planets, charms believed to shield them from harm. Every act was deliberate, every gesture filled with meaning, as if humanity itself could reach up and touch the stars. Not all rituals were acts of devotion. Some sought to manipulate the cosmic forces, bending their power to human will. A group of robed figures gathered in a hidden grove, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of torches. At the center of their circle lay a polished bowl filled with water, reflecting the sky above like a second, quieter universe. One by one, they spoke their desires into the bowl, whispers of ambition, of vengeance, of forbidden love. As they chanted, the water began to ripple, as if the heavens themselves were listening. These cosmic rituals were not without risk. The stars, for all their beauty, were unpredictable. Alignments that seemed promising could twist into something terrible, their power turning on those who sought to control it. A man, desperate to change his fortune, once offered a sacrifice beneath a sky dominated by Saturn and Mars, planets of discipline and war. He asked for strength, but found himself consumed by unrelenting anger, his life unraveling as he fought battles he could never win. The stars had given him what he asked for, but not in the way he had hoped. The Greeks knew that the heavens held more than beauty. They held warnings, opportunities, and, perhaps most hauntingly, mirrors of humanity itself. To gaze at the stars was to confront the vastness of existence, the terrifying realization that lives were shaped by forces far beyond understanding. Yet, in their rituals and interpretations, there was also a defiance, a refusal to be powerless, a determination to find meaning in the chaos. As the night deepened, the priest at the temple watched as Venus and Jupiter began to drift apart. The moment had passed, the conjunction dissolving like a dream upon waking. He lowered his tablet and closed his eyes, his mind racing with the implications of what he had seen. Somewhere, someone's life had changed, though they might not yet know it. The stars had spoken, their light carving truths into the darkness, leaving the world below to interpret their message. The candlelight flickered, casting wavering shadows on the walls of the dimly lit room. In the center stood a woman, her face pale but calm, her hands steady as they held a bowl of water. The silence was thick, heavy, broken only by the soft crackle of the fire burning in the hearth. Her eyes were fixed on the surface of the water, its stillness almost unnatural, as though it held its breath, waiting. She had been warned. Scrying was not for the faint-hearted, nor for those unprepared to face truths they might not wish to see. But desperation had a way of silencing fear. Her husband had been gone for weeks, taken by the whispers of war, and she needed answers. Would he return? Would he still breathe the air of this world, or had his soul already crossed into the unknown? She leaned closer, her breath ghosting over the water's surface. Then, it began. A ripple. Small at first, then growing, spreading like the echo of a scream in an empty canyon. She felt the pull, as if the water itself reached out to her, drawing her in. Images flickered, unclear, distorted, but there. A battlefield drenched in rain, faces twisted in agony, a broken sword lying in the mud. And then him, her husband, kneeling, his hands clasped as if in prayer. Relief flooded her heart, he was alive. But the water churned, and the image shifted. His eyes, once familiar and warm, now stared back at her, empty and unseeing. She dropped the bowl, the water splashing onto the floor, the vision dissolving into nothingness. Her chest heaved as she clutched at her heart, the weight of what she had seen crushing her. The future was not always a gift, it was a burden, and sometimes, it was better left unknown. Scrying had always been an act of both wonder and terror. Whether it was the tranquil surface of water, the shifting light of a mirror, or the hypnotic dance of flames, these mediums were not merely tools, they were gateways. To gaze into them was to open a door, one that might not close again. In the forest, far from prying eyes, an old man sat before a fire. His face was lined with years and secrets, his hands withered but strong as they stirred a pot of herbs over the flames. The smoke rose in delicate spirals, twisting and curling until it formed shapes, a bird taking flight, a serpent coiling, a child crying out. His gaze never wavered, his murmured words the melody that only the fire seemed to understand. He had spent decades perfecting his craft, learning to coax the flames into revealing their truths. But tonight, the fire was restless, its movements chaotic, its heat sharp and unforgiving. The shapes it formed were dark, jagged, and filled with malice. He frowned, his heart heavy with foreboding. The fire had spoken, and its message was clear: blood would be spilled before the next full moon. Scrying in mirrors was said to be the most dangerous of all. Mirrors did not just reflect, they absorbed, capturing fragments of the soul with every glance. A young woman, her hands trembling, lit a single candle and placed it before her mirror. She had heard the stories, the warnings, but her curiosity outweighed her caution. Her question was simple yet profound: would she find love? She stared into the glass, her reflection staring back, unblinking. Minutes passed, then hours, until the world around her seemed to fade, leaving only the mirror and its secrets. The candle flickered, and her reflection changed. It smiled, not the soft, hopeful smile she had given it, but something darker, more knowing. Then, it raised a hand, though hers remained still. Her breath caught in her throat as the figure in the mirror leaned closer, its face inches from hers, its eyes empty but piercing. It whispered a single word, one she would never forget, though she could never speak of it aloud. She screamed, shattering the spell, and covered the mirror with a cloth. But she knew the damage was done. She had seen something she was never meant to see, and it had seen her in return. The methods varied, but the risks were universal. Scrying was not a game, it was a contract, an exchange. Those who sought answers paid with pieces of themselves, whether it was their peace, their sanity, or something even more precious. The fire could burn, the water could drown, and the mirror could trap. Yet, people returned to these forbidden arts, again and again, drawn by the promise of knowledge, no matter the cost. There were stories of those who had gone too far. A man, obsessed with his scrying mirror, refused to look away, even as his reflection began to change. His family found him weeks later, his body lifeless, his eyes fixed on the glass, which now showed nothing but darkness. Another tale spoke of a village elder who scryed into the flames for guidance during a drought. The fire showed him a vision of rain but demanded a sacrifice in return. Desperate, he offered his own life, and the rains came. But they did not stop, drowning the village in an unending flood. Even in its gentler forms, scrying was not without its consequences. A child, playing by a stream, saw his future reflected in the water, a man, strong and wise, but alone. He grew up haunted by the vision, his every choice shaped by a fear of fulfilling it. When he finally reached the age he had seen, he realized the truth: it was his obsession with avoiding the prophecy that had made it come to pass. Scrying was a dance with the unknown, a fragile balance between curiosity and caution, hope and despair. It was a reminder that the future, for all its allure, was a double-edged sword. To glimpse it was to risk being cut, and the scars it left were often deeper than anyone could have imagined. Yet, for those who dared, the act of scrying was also an act of defiance, a refusal to accept ignorance, a challenge to the mysteries that governed their lives. It was both their curse and their salvation, a testament to the enduring human spirit, forever seeking, forever questioning, no matter the cost. The air was heavy with the scent of sulfur and burning herbs, the room dimly lit by the faint glow of molten metal. A figure stood at the center, cloaked in shadows, hands trembling over an ancient cauldron. Each movement was deliberate, almost reverent, as though the act itself held the power to reshape the world. This was not mere curiosity, it was an act of will, a declaration against the unchangeable. A single vial of quicksilver was poured into the cauldron, its liquid surface swirling like trapped starlight. The figure whispered an incantation, words older than any written language, their tone both commanding and desperate. The elements had to be balanced perfectly, one mistake, one hesitation, and the ritual would consume everything. But the promise of transformation was worth the risk. Alchemy had always danced on the edge of science and magic, blending the tangible with the intangible. To turn base metals into gold was not just an act of greed but of rebellion. It was the belief that even the humblest of things could become something extraordinary. And yet, the true alchemists sought something far greater than wealth. They sought the philosopher's stone, the key to transformation not just of matter but of the soul itself. In a darkened cave, far from the prying eyes of the world, another alchemist labored. Her hands were calloused, her hair streaked with silver, not from age, but from countless nights spent in the glow of her furnace. Before her lay a small, fragile chrysalis suspended in a jar filled with liquid that shimmered like oil on water. She had spent years collecting the rare elements, deciphering the cryptic texts, and enduring the ridicule of those who called her mad. But she knew she was close. Her voice shook as she recited the final words of the ritual, her heart pounding in rhythm with the crackling flames. The liquid began to bubble, and the chrysalis trembled. A faint light emerged, growing brighter until it filled the cave with a golden hue. And then, silence. She held her breath, her hands trembling as she opened the jar. From within, a creature unfurled, its wings delicate and iridescent, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. It was unlike anything she had ever seen, a being born not of nature but of her will. She had created life, and in doing so, she had transformed herself. But alchemy was not without its cost. For every success, there were countless failures, and each failure carried its own weight. A man once sought to use alchemy to cure his ailing daughter, convinced he could transmute illness into health. He worked tirelessly, ignoring the warnings etched into the margins of his books. On the final night, he placed a lock of her hair into the potion and watched as it turned to brilliant gold. But when he returned to her bedside, he found her body cold, her spirit gone. The potion had worked, it had drawn the sickness out of her. But in doing so, it had taken everything else. The alchemy of transformation was not just about changing elements, but about changing oneself. It required sacrifice, discipline, and a willingness to confront the unknown. One legend spoke of an alchemist who sought to transform his own body, to shed his mortal form and achieve immortality. He drank a potion brewed from the rarest of elements, his body convulsing as it began to change. His skin turned to stone, his blood to molten lava, his eyes to glowing embers. He had achieved his goal, but at a cost he had never anticipated. He was immortal, yes, but he was no longer human. He wandered the earth, a living statue, his soul trapped in a form that could never die. The rituals themselves were as varied as the alchemists who practiced them. Some used fire, feeding it with precise combinations of minerals and herbs to coax it into revealing its secrets. Others turned to water, its reflective surface acting as both a canvas and a mirror, showing them what could be if only they dared to try. Still others used air, infusing it with sacred chants and rare perfumes to create an atmosphere charged with possibility. One of the most forbidden rituals involved the use of human essence, blood, hair, tears. It was said that these elements, when combined with the right ingredients, could create a potion capable of changing not just the physical but the emotional. Love could be turned into hatred, fear into courage, despair into hope. But the cost was always personal. To take a part of oneself and give it to the elements was to lose it forever, and not everyone could bear the emptiness that followed. Yet, for all its dangers, alchemy remained a beacon of hope for those who refused to accept the limitations of their world. It was a reminder that change was always possible, that even the most ordinary could become extraordinary. And for those who dared to believe, who were willing to risk everything for a chance at transformation, it was the ultimate act of defiance against fate. The night was silent, but the air trembled with an unspoken promise. A procession moved through the darkness, torches flickering in their hands, casting long, wavering shadows on the ancient stone walls. Their faces were veiled, their steps deliberate, each one carrying a sacred purpose. At the center of it all was a woman, her head bowed, her hands clutching a bundle wrapped in cloth. To the untrained eye, it seemed like nothing more than a ritual. To those within, it was the lifeline of their belief, the Eleusinian mysteries, a sacred thread connecting mortals to gods. They reached the heart of the sanctuary, a place whispered about in fear and awe, a place where even kings dared not tread without invitation. The temple of Demeter stood imposing and silent, a monolith against the starlit sky. It was here that Persephone's story unfolded, a tale of abduction, longing, and the eternal struggle between light and darkness. It was not just a myth, but a reflection of the human soul, torn between the world above and the shadows below. The bundle was laid upon the altar, its contents hidden from view. A priestess stepped forward, her voice rising in a chant so haunting it seemed to come from the earth itself. The words were incomprehensible, ancient syllables strung together in a melody that sent shivers down the spine. The participants knelt, their torches extinguished, leaving them in complete darkness. The air grew cold, and the silence became unbearable. It was said that in this moment, Persephone herself descended among them, her presence a shadow that touched every heart. In the pitch-black stillness, the tale came alive, not as a story told but as an experience lived. You could feel the weight of Demeter's grief, the endless search for her stolen daughter. You could hear the echo of Persephone's cries as Hades' chariot carried her into the underworld. The participants were not mere spectators, they were drawn into the narrative, their hearts pounding as if they themselves were being taken to the land of the dead. A sudden burst of light illuminated the temple. A single flame, small but defiant, pierced the darkness. It symbolized the moment Persephone tasted the pomegranate seeds, sealing her fate. The air was charged with emotion, anger at her captivity, sorrow for her loss, and yet, a strange sense of hope. The flame grew, passed from one torch to another, until the temple was ablaze with light. It was a reminder that even in the deepest despair, there is always the promise of renewal. The rites were not for the faint-hearted. Participants spoke of visions that left them trembling, of voices that seemed to come from within and without. They were shown things no mortal was meant to see, images of the underworld, glimpses of eternity, the delicate balance that held the universe together. Some said they saw Persephone herself, her eyes filled with a sorrow so profound it seemed to echo through time. And yet, there was a strange beauty in her sadness. Persephone was not just a victim but a queen, her strength forged in the fires of her suffering. She ruled the underworld with a quiet dignity, her presence a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable loss, one can find purpose. The participants felt her duality, the maiden who danced in the fields of spring and the sovereign who walked the shadowed halls of the dead. In her, they saw their own struggles, their own battles between joy and pain, hope and despair. The climax of the ritual was both terrifying and transcendent. A figure cloaked in black appeared, his face hidden, his voice a low, resonant hum. He was Hades, lord of the underworld, and his presence filled the temple with a suffocating weight. The participants held their breath, their hearts pounding as he approached the altar. With a single motion, he unveiled the bundle, revealing a simple stalk of wheat, a symbol of life, death, and rebirth. The priestess took the stalk and held it high, her voice breaking the tension with a cry of triumph. The participants erupted into chants, their voices rising like a wave, washing away the darkness. The wheat was divided among them, each person taking a piece as a sacred token. It was a reminder of Persephone's return to the world above, of the promise that spring would always follow winter. As the ritual came to an end, the participants emerged from the temple, their faces pale, their eyes wide. They had been changed, touched by something they could not explain. They carried the story of Persephone in their hearts, not as a tale but as a truth. They understood, in a way they never had before, the cycles of life and death, loss and renewal. And though they could not speak of what they had witnessed, bound by sacred oaths of silence, they carried its weight with them, a secret shared only with the gods. The Eleusinian mysteries were not just a rite but an awakening. They reminded those who dared to take part that life is a fragile thread, constantly weaving between light and shadow. And in that thread lies a beauty that can never be broken. The lyre's soft, mournful notes floated through the dense, twilight air. It was as though the music itself carried a weight, heavy with longing and sorrow. The figure sat alone, the instrument cradled gently in his arms, his fingers plucking each string with deliberate care. Orpheus. His name was a whispered legend, his story one of love so fierce that it defied even the gates of death. Yet here, in the dim flicker of a solitary flame, his teachings told a different tale, one not of defiance but of surrender, of understanding the inescapable pull of the underworld. The cult of Orpheus was not spoken of lightly. It was not for those seeking comfort or simple answers. Those who sought its teachings came with trembling hearts and questions that burned like a wound. What lies beyond death? Can the soul truly rise again? Orpheus, who had journeyed where no living man should tread, carried these answers. But they were not easily given. They were veiled in riddles, taught in shadows, and revealed only to those willing to face the truth. The initiates gathered under the canopy of night, the stars above cold and distant, as if watching with indifference. They carried small offerings, flowers, coins, or sometimes a lock of hair. These were not for the gods, but symbols of their own mortality, tokens to remind them of the fragility of their existence. In the center of the gathering, a fire burned low, casting ghostly shapes that danced and twisted like souls caught between worlds. A voice broke the silence, low and steady, like the hum of the earth itself. It spoke of the underworld, not as a place of torment, but as a mirror of life. "We all walk with shadows," it said. "But do we see them for what they are? Do we understand that they are not our enemies, but our companions, teaching us to cherish the light?" The word struck like a blade, cutting through the illusions each person carried. Some wept silently, others clenched their fists, as if trying to hold on to something that was already slipping away. Then came the lyre. Its sound was unlike anything they had heard before, aching, haunting, as though it resonated with the very bones of the earth. Orpheus did not speak, he let the music tell his story. It spoke of Eurydice, her laughter echoing through fields of green, her voice a melody of its own. It spoke of her sudden silence, the cold weight of death, and the void it left behind. The initiates could feel his agony, his desperate plunge into the underworld, his hope that burned so brightly it threatened to consume him. But it was not hope that brought him back. It was despair. The moment he turned, the moment he looked upon Eurydice and saw her fade into nothingness, he understood. The underworld could not be conquered. Death could not be reversed. It was not an enemy to be fought, but a force to be accepted. This was the heart of the teaching, not a promise of resurrection, but a reconciliation with loss. The rituals that followed were not elaborate. They were quiet, almost meditative, each person left to confront their own shadows. Water was poured into shallow bowls, its surface rippling like the fabric of time. Each initiate gazed into it, searching for something they could not name. Some saw faces, loved ones long gone, their eyes filled with a sadness that mirrored their own. Others saw only darkness, a void that seemed to stretch forever. And in that darkness, they found themselves. The final rite was simple yet profound. Each person held a single seed in their hand, a pomegranate seed, small and crimson, a reminder of the underworld's power. They were told to bury it in the earth, not as a symbol of death, but as a promise of transformation. "What dies does not vanish," the voice said. "It becomes. It changes. And so shall you." The initiates left in silence, their faces pale, their hearts heavy with what they had learned. They did not speak of what they had seen or felt, words seemed too fragile to contain such truths. But in their eyes, there was a flicker of something new, a quiet understanding, a strength born from facing the unfathomable. Orpheus's lyre lay silent, its strings still vibrating with the echoes of the night. He sat alone once more, his gaze distant, as though looking beyond the veil of the living. He knew the cost of what he taught, the weight it placed on those who sought his wisdom. But he also knew it was necessary. To live fully, one must understand death. To find light, one must walk through shadows. And in that balance, there was a beauty that even the gods envied. The fire flickered in the distance, its warmth seeping into the night air. There was no moon tonight, only the stars, casting their cold gaze down upon the earth. The silence was thick, almost suffocating. But in the shadows, a figure moved, slow, deliberate, as though guided by some unseen force. This was no ordinary person, but a member of the cabaret, a secret brotherhood whose rituals were whispered about but never spoken of in the light of day. The air was heavy with the scent of incense, and beneath it, there was the unmistakable smell of earth, raw and untamed. The figure paused, standing at the edge of a hidden clearing where ancient stones lay scattered, half covered by ivy. In the center of the stones, a fire burned brightly, its flames dancing as if alive, casting long, shifting shadows. Around the fire stood others, their faces hidden beneath dark hoods, their presence almost ethereal. They were the Cabaret, a brotherhood known to few, their practices older than the land itself. These men were not ordinary, and their teachings were not for the faint of heart. There were rumors of strange, forbidden rites, of transformations, of power that could alter fate itself. But those who sought the Cabaret found more than they expected. What they found was not just knowledge, but a deep, unsettling truth about the nature of existence and the price of power. The initiates arrived one by one, their eyes wide with a mix of fear and anticipation. Each carried a symbol, a token of their willingness to surrender something precious, an heirloom, a cherished memory, a secret they had carried for years. The Cabaret would accept their offering in silence. There were no words spoken aloud, no promises made. The ritual was never about assurances, but about trust that the initiates would be changed, and that they could never turn back. The first ritual began with a single breath. The initiates stood in a circle, hands clasped tightly at their sides. The air was thick with the weight of unspoken words, and the fire in the center of the circle seemed to grow, its flames licking the edges of the darkened sky. The Cabaret stepped forward, their movements slow, measured, and in sync with the rhythm of the night. There was no chanting, no elaborate songs. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the soft, steady breath of the brotherhood. Each initiate was drawn forward, one by one, until they stood before the fire. Their offering, a small, worn amulet, was placed into the flames. The fire devoured it, and as it burned, a strange transformation took place. The initiates' faces paled, their bodies stiffened, as if they could feel their very souls being stripped away. What followed was always the same. A vision. Some saw the faces of those they had lost, their loved ones, their families, reaching out for them. Others saw a darkness, vast and endless, like a storm cloud swallowing everything in its path. And in the center of it all, the Cabaret stood, their faces impassive, watching as each initiate was tested, their fears laid bare. No one could say exactly what the Cabaret sought, but it was clear that each test had a purpose. Those who withstood the vision returned to the circle, their eyes empty, their hearts heavy with the burden of knowledge they had gained. Those who faltered were never seen again. Their fates were left to the fire, swallowed by the dark secrets that the brotherhood guarded so fiercely. As the night wore on, the fire burned lower, the air cooler. The rituals became more intense, the brothers more insistent. The tests grew more personal. Some initiates were asked to face their deepest regrets, to confront the very core of their being. Others were drawn into the depths of their own desires, forced to reckon with the darkness inside them. And through it all, the Cabaret watched, silent, unwavering, their eyes gleaming with an ancient knowledge that few could comprehend. But for all the fear, there was also a sense of something greater at play, something deeper, more meaningful. The Cabaret were not merely a cult. They were a force, a presence that had existed since before time itself, a brotherhood bound by something far more powerful than mere rituals. They were united not by blood, but by a shared understanding of the fragile, fleeting nature of life. And it was this understanding that gave them their power. The final ritual came just before dawn, as the first light of morning began to creep over the horizon. The fire was almost gone, its embers flickering weakly in the cold wind. The Cabaret stood in a final circle, the initiates in the center. The world seemed to hold its breath as the leader of the brotherhood stepped forward, his eyes glowing with the fire's last remnants. There was no need for words now. The initiation was complete. The price had been paid. The brotherhood was whole. And yet, the emptiness remained. The Cabaret did not seek followers, nor did they crave power for its own sake. They had long since come to understand that the truest power lay in the ability to accept the inevitable, to walk through the shadows without fear. The rituals, the secret practices, they were not ends in themselves, but tools to help those who sought the brotherhood understand that death, like everything else, was simply part of the great circle. They offered not immortality, but wisdom, the wisdom to know when to let go, when to surrender to the flow of life, and when to embrace the unknown. As the fire died and the last embers flickered out, the initiates stood, their faces as silent as the night around them. The Cabaret had shown them what they needed to see. And though the path ahead was uncertain, they knew one thing for certain: they would never be the same again. The moon hung low in the velvet sky, its pale light brushing against the ancient stone circle. The air was still, the kind of silence that held its breath, waiting for something profound to happen. In the center of the clearing, women stood, their faces hidden by soft, flowing veils that caught the moonlight like threads of silver. Their movements were deliberate, graceful, as though they carried the weight of centuries within their steps. The flames of a sacred fire flickered nearby, its warmth spreading in tendrils that reached toward the cold earth. The women's voices rose softly, weaving together in a chant so old its words were untraceable, but the power in them was unmistakable. It was not a prayer for guidance or a cry for help, it was something deeper. It was a call, a summoning of something that only they could understand. Among them stood a young woman, her trembling hands clutching a small bundle wrapped in cloth. She had waited years for this moment, years to stand among these women who held secrets so profound that even the men of their village whispered in awe about them. Tonight, she would learn what it meant to belong to this sacred circle. The leader of the group stepped forward, her eyes sharp and steady beneath the veil. Her presence commanded respect, yet her voice was soft, almost tender, as she reached out and placed a hand on the young woman's shoulder. For a moment, no words were spoken, but the silence between them spoke volumes. The fire flared as if in response, and the ceremony began. The women moved as one, their steps a silent dance that mirrored the rhythm of the wind in the trees. They carried with them items of significance, small jars filled with herbs, braided strands of hair, tokens of lives lived and lost. These objects were not just offerings, they were pieces of their souls, fragments of stories that would be shared in the safety of the circle. As the chant grew louder, the young woman felt a warmth rise within her chest. It was not just the heat of the fire, but something more, a connection, a thread that tied her to the women around her and to those who had stood in this same place long before her time. She closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her, feeling as though she was no longer just herself, but part of something far greater. This was not a place for fear. It was a place for truth. Here, women could speak of things they dared not share elsewhere: dreams, pain, joy, and power that the outside world refused to acknowledge. They could cry openly without shame, laugh without restraint, and stand strong without apology. The rituals varied. Some were solemn, honoring those who had passed, their names whispered into the night so they would never be forgotten. Others were celebrations of life, of the strength it took to endure, to nurture, to fight. The women danced with abandon during these moments, their laughter mingling with the crackle of the fire, a sound that carried far into the night. But there were also moments of quiet reflection. One ritual called for each woman to sit before the fire and hold a mirror in her hands. The mirror was not just glass, but a tool, a way to see beyond the surface. As the young woman gazed into hers, she saw not only her own face, but the faces of the women who had come before her, her mother, her grandmother, and countless others whose names she would never know but whose strength she carried within her. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but no one told her to hide them. Here, her vulnerability was not a weakness but a testament to her courage. These rituals were more than ceremonies, they were acts of defiance, a reclaiming of power in a world that so often sought to strip it away. The women who gathered here were not merely participants in a tradition, they were protectors of a legacy, keepers of knowledge that could not be erased. One ritual was especially sacred. It required the women to walk barefoot across the earth, their feet brushing against the cool grass, their steps deliberate and slow. They carried with them bowls of water, each drop representing a wish, a hope, a prayer. When they reached the fire, they poured the water into the flames, watching as the steam rose into the air, carrying their intentions to the stars. For some, the wish was for healing, a mending of broken hearts, fractured families, or weary bodies. For others, it was for strength, the courage to face a world that often felt unkind. Whatever the wish, it was given freely, without judgment, and received with reverence by the women who stood together. The leader spoke then, her voice steady and clear. She reminded them of their worth, of the power that lay within them not because of what they had done, but because of who they were. Her words were a balm, a reassurance that they were enough, just as they were. As the night wore on, the young woman felt her fear dissolve, replaced by a quiet strength she had never known. She understood now why the women of her family had always spoken of this place with such reverence. It was not just a gathering, it was a sanctuary, a reminder that no matter how harsh the world outside might be, there was always a place where she belonged. When the ceremony ended, the women stood in silence, their faces glowing in the light of the dying fire. They reached out and clasped hands, forming a circle that felt unbreakable. The young woman felt the warmth of their touch, the steady beat of their hearts, and she knew she would never forget this night. As the flames flickered out and the first light of dawn touched the horizon, the women began to leave, their steps quiet but purposeful. The young woman lingered for a moment, her heart full, her spirit lighter than it had been in years. She did not look back as she walked away, knowing that the strength of the circle would stay with her always, a fire burning quietly within her, ready to guide her whenever she needed it most. The door splintered under the force of the soldiers' boots, the crash echoing through the quiet night. Inside, a small group huddled around a single flickering candle, their faces pale with fear but resolute. A moment before, their voices had mingled in a soft chant, an ancient hymn whispered in defiance of laws written to silence them. Now, the hymn was replaced by gasps, the candle trembling as the door fell inward. The soldiers entered like shadows, their armor glinting coldly in the dim light. They said nothing, their orders clear in the steel of their weapons. One of the women rose to her feet, her hand steady despite the tremor in her voice as she spoke. "We mean no harm. We gather only to honor what is sacred." Her words fell into the silence, met not with understanding but with the clank of chains. The soldiers moved methodically, binding wrists and extinguishing the candle with a swift motion. Darkness enveloped the room, leaving only the echoes of breathing and the sound of boots against the floor as they led the group away. These gatherings were not crimes born of malice. They were acts of survival, attempts to hold on to something greater than themselves in a world determined to strip it away. The cults that thrived in the shadows were not united by hatred or greed, but by a shared need for connection, for faith, for meaning. They whispered the names of gods long forgotten, lit fires in places abandoned by the world above, and sang songs that carried the weight of centuries. To the state, this was treason. Anything that drew people together outside of its control was seen as a threat, a crack in the foundation of its power. Laws were passed, harsh and unyielding, banning practices that dared to exist beyond the sanctioned rituals. Temples were raised, their stones repurposed for monuments to rulers who demanded worship for themselves. Statues of deities were torn down, their faces shattered, their names erased from official records. But faith is not so easily destroyed. It finds a way to survive, even in the harshest conditions. In the forests and caves, people gathered in secret, their prayers muffled by the weight of the earth above. They carried their gods in their hearts, and symbols carved into hidden places, and words passed from parent to child like precious heirlooms. One such place was a cavern deep beneath the city, its entrance concealed by a tangle of roots and stones. Inside, the air was cool and damp, the walls covered in faint markings that glowed softly in the light of torches. This was a sanctuary, a place where the faithful could breathe freely, if only for a moment. Here, a man knelt before an altar carved from stone, his hands resting on its surface as he whispered a prayer. He had lost everything to the state, his home, his family, his name, but he had not lost this. The altar bore the symbol of his God, a simple mark that had guided his people for generations. As he prayed, others gathered around him, their faces illuminated by the flickering light. They carried scars, both visible and hidden, reminders of what they had endured to be here. Each carried a story, a child taken for questioning, a loved one who never returned, a home reduced to ash. Yet they stood together, their presence a testament to their resilience. But the state was always watching. Spies lurked in the shadows, listening for whispers of forbidden gatherings. Rewards were offered for information, turning neighbor against neighbor, friend against friend. Trust was a fragile thing, and betrayal could come from the unlikeliest places. One night, the cavern was betrayed. The soldiers arrived in force, their torches lighting the way as they descended into the earth. The faithful scattered, their prayers replaced by cries of panic. The man at the altar turned to face them, his hands outstretched as though he could hold back the tide. They took him first, his voice echoing as he cried out, not in fear but in defiance. "You can take my life, but you cannot take my faith." His words lingered long after the cavern fell silent. Those who escaped carried them with them, a rallying cry that spread like wildfire through the underground networks of the outlawed. The state's suppression was relentless. It sought to stamp out every ember of rebellion, every flicker of faith that could ignite into something larger. It failed to understand that faith was not a flame that could be extinguished, it was a spark that lived within each person, waiting for the right moment to ignite. In the prisons where the faithful were held, they shared their prayers in whispers, their hymns sung so softly that they became indistinguishable from the sound of breathing. In the fields where they were sent to labor, they carved symbols into the soil, knowing they would be washed away but creating them anyway. Even in death, they defied the state. Their funerals became acts of rebellion, their bodies buried with tokens of their faith, their names spoken in rituals the state could not control. For every gathering disrupted, another took its place. For every leader captured, another rose to lead. The state's suppression was a battle it could never truly win, for it fought not against men and women but against an idea, a belief that transcended the reach of laws and swords. The faithful continued to gather, their ceremonies adapting to the ever-tightening grip of the state. They found ways to conceal their rituals, disguising them as harmless traditions or blending them with the sanctioned practices. They became shadows, moving silently through the cracks of the world above, their faith burning as brightly as ever. In the end, the state could never understand what it was up against. It saw only rebellion, defiance, a threat to its power. It could not see the beauty in the faith it sought to destroy, the love and hope that bound the faithful together. The faithful knew the risks. They knew the price of their defiance, the danger that lurked in every shadow. But they also knew the power of their faith, the strength it gave them to endure, to resist, to survive. And so, they continued. In the forests and caves, in the prisons and fields, in the quiet corners of a world that sought to silence them, they prayed, they sang, they believed. The old woman's hands moved deftly over the herbs spread before her, fingers gnarled but steady as she plucked leaves and snapped stems. The air was thick with the mingling scents of sage, lavender, and something sharper, darker, that seemed to cling to the back of the throat. She hummed softly under her breath, a tune as ancient as the earth, as she ground the herbs into a fine powder. On the wooden table sat two bowls, one filled with a golden, fragrant paste, the other with a substance so black it seemed to absorb the flickering light of the candle. "One heals," she murmured, her voice as soft as the wind through the trees. "The other kills." It was a truth as old as time, one that carried the weight of countless lives saved and taken. The duality of the plants that grew in the wild was not a secret, but a gift, a burden, a weapon. In the right hands, the leaves could mend wounds, cure fevers, and draw poison from the blood. In the wrong hands, or perhaps the right ones, depending on the intent, they could stop a heart mid-beat, turn food to ash in the stomach, or bring a peaceful sleep from which one would never wake. The villagers whispered her name with equal parts reverence and fear. They brought their sick children to her doorstep, desperate for the teas and poultices she prepared with such care. They also crossed themselves when they passed her home, eyes darting to the rows of drying plants hanging from her eaves. For she was not merely a healer, she was a keeper of the old ways. She knew the secrets of the nightshade and the wolfsbane, the deadly allure of hemlock, and the burning truth hidden within the bright petals of monkshood. There was a night when a young woman came to her door, her face pale and her hands trembling as she held out a bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside was a man, his breathing shallow, his lips blue. "Please," the woman whispered, tears streaking her face. "He's been poisoned." The old woman looked at her, then at the man. She said nothing, only gestured for them to enter. She set to work immediately, grinding herbs, boiling water, and murmuring words in a language the young woman did not recognize. The air grew heavy with the scent of the brew she prepared, a mix of hope and desperation that clung to the walls. Hours passed, the candle burning low. The man's breathing steadied, his color returning, and the young woman wept with relief. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. The old woman met her gaze, her eyes sharp and unreadable. "The plants give life," she said, her tone steady. "But remember, they also take it." The young woman nodded, clutching the man's hand. She didn't see the old woman's fingers linger for a moment over a small pouch hanging from her belt, its contents enough to send anyone into eternal sleep. The line between healing and harm was thinner than most dared to admit. A dose too large, a leaf too bitter, and the cure became the curse. Yet, this balance was what gave the plants their power, their mystery. The old woman knew this better than anyone. Her knowledge was not hers alone, it was inherited, passed down through whispers and rituals, from healer to healer, through generations. Each plant had a story, a spirit, a purpose. The willow offered peace to the fevered mind, its bark steeped in water to ease pain. But the oleander, beautiful and treacherous, could bring death with a single petal slipped into a drink. One evening, a man arrived at her door, his face shadowed by the hood of his cloak. He did not speak of sickness or wounds, but placed a coin on the table, its surface marked with the sigil of a powerful house. He wanted something different, something that required no explanation. The old woman stared at the coin, then at the man. She nodded once and turned to her shelves. She selected a small jar, its contents a fine, pale powder, and handed it to him without a word. Later that week, word spread through the village of a lord who had fallen suddenly, his lips blackened, his cup still clutched in his lifeless hand. No one spoke of the old woman, but the villagers' eyes lingered on her door a little longer than usual. She did not flinch under their stares. She knew what she had done, just as she knew the weight of the knowledge she carried. The power of the plants was neither good nor evil, it was simply power, and it was up to her how it was wielded. On nights when the moon was high, she walked the forest paths, her basket swinging at her side as she gathered what she needed. She whispered to the plants as she plucked their leaves and roots, thanking them for their gifts. Her hands moved with certainty, guided by memory and instinct. Some nights, she felt the weight of her choices, the lives she had touched, both saved and ended. But she also felt the unyielding pull of her purpose, the knowledge that what she did was necessary. In the quiet of her home, she prepared her remedies, her poisons, her prayers. She was a healer, a keeper, a protector of wisdom older than the stone walls of the village. And though the villagers feared her, they also relied on her, for they knew that in her hands lay the balance of life and death, the delicate thread that connected them all. The candle burned low as she worked, her shadow flickering against the walls. Her hands moved with the grace of years, her voice steady as she whispered the names of the plants. And in the stillness of the night, the duality of her craft remained, a testament to the power of the earth, to the choices that shaped her, and to the fragile line between healing and harm. The firelight flickered against the stone walls, casting shadows that seemed alive, shifting and swaying as though in rhythm with the soft, unearthly hum that filled the air. In the center of the circle, a wooden bowl passed from hand to hand, each participant taking a sip of the dark, viscous liquid inside. The taste was bitter, almost burning, but no one hesitated. The shaman stood silently, his eyes closed, his breathing deep and measured. His hands were raised to the sky, fingers trembling as if reaching for something unseen. Around him, the others began to sway, their movements no longer their own but guided by a force that seemed to pulse with the very heartbeat of the earth. At first, it was subtle, a faint vibration under the skin, a tingling at the edges of perception. But then it grew, spreading like fire through veins, unraveling the boundaries of the body and mind. The walls of the room seemed to melt away, revealing an endless expanse of stars that shimmered and danced in impossible patterns. One woman gasped, clutching her chest as if her heart might burst. Her eyes were wide, but they no longer saw the world as it was. Instead, she beheld visions of a great tree, its roots stretching deep into the earth, its branches cradling the heavens. She could hear the voices of her ancestors whispering through its leaves, their words a mixture of sorrow and joy, pain and wisdom. Another man wept, tears streaming down his face as he knelt on the ground, his hands gripping the dirt. He felt the weight of every decision he had ever made, every life he had touched or harmed. And yet, in that overwhelming flood of emotion, there was peace, a sense of being stripped bare and accepted, flaws and all. The shaman began to chant, his voice low and resonant, each word vibrating through the air like a physical force. It was a language no one understood, but everyone felt, a primal sound that seemed to unlock something buried deep within. Colors exploded behind closed eyes, swirling and shifting in ways that defied comprehension. Shapes emerged, fluid and ephemeral, each carrying its own story, its own truth. A young woman saw herself as a child, running barefoot through a field, her laughter echoing like a song. Then, she was an old woman, her hands wrinkled but strong, holding a newborn wrapped in soft linen. Time lost its meaning. Minutes, hours, lifetimes, none of it mattered. In that altered state, the participants were neither here nor there. They existed in a space beyond, a place where the self dissolved and only the essence remained. For some, the experience was ecstasy, waves of love and connection washing over them, filling them with light. For others, it was terrifying, a confrontation with their darkest fears, their deepest regrets. But even in the terror, there was transformation, a breaking down of walls that had been built over years of pain and denial. The substances they consumed were more than mere plants or powders. They were conduits, bridges between worlds. The shamans and keepers of the old ways knew this, treating each preparation with reverence. Every root, every leaf, every fragment of bark was chosen with care, infused with intention. The effects were not uniform. Some felt their bodies dissolve into the earth, becoming one with the soil and the trees, the rivers and the mountains. Others soared through the cosmos, their spirits weightless and free, brushing against the edges of infinity. A man in his 50s, weary from years of toil, suddenly found himself standing before a radiant being, its form shifting between light and shadow. It spoke to him without words, its presence filling him with a sense of purpose he had long forgotten. When he opened his eyes, tears streamed down his face, but he smiled, a smile that carried both pain and gratitude. The shaman continued his chant, his voice now joined by the group as they murmured in unison, their tones rising and falling like waves. The room was no longer a room, it was a living, breathing entity, pulsating with energy. Then, as suddenly as it began, the intensity began to fade. The vision softened, the sounds quieted, and the participants found themselves once again aware of their surroundings. The fire still burned, its embers glowing like tiny stars. The air was thick with the scent of herbs and sweat, and the hum of their collective breath filled the space. No one spoke at first. They sat in silence, each processing the enormity of what they had experienced. Some clasped hands, finding solace in the touch of another. Others stared into the fire, their eyes reflecting the flames as if seeing them for the first time. For those who partook, the substances were not an escape but an opening, a way to confront the truths they had buried, to connect with something larger than themselves. They emerged changed, their hearts lighter, their spirits stronger. And as the shaman lowered his hands and opened his eyes, his gaze swept over the group with a quiet intensity. He did not need to speak, his expression said everything. What they had shared could not be undone, nor could it be fully explained. It was an experience that lived within them now, a thread woven into the fabric of their being. Outside, the night stretched on, the stars shining brightly above. But within, each person carried their own constellation, a map of their journey etched into their souls. And though they might never fully understand what they had seen or felt, they knew they had touched something sacred, something that would remain with them always. The air was thick with the scent of herbs and oils, a mixture that felt both soothing and strange, as if it held secrets older than time. In the dim light of the healing temple, shadows danced along the walls, mimicking the movements of those gathered in silence. There was no sound but the soft crackle of a small fire and the occasional rustle of robes. A young boy lay on the stone altar at the center of the room, his breathing shallow, his skin pale. His mother stood nearby, her hands trembling as she clutched a talisman shaped like a serpent entwined around a staff. Tears streamed down her face, but her eyes were filled with something more than despair, hope, desperate and raw, clinging to the whispered promises of the temple's healers. The head healer, an older man with withered hands and piercing eyes, stepped forward. He carried a bowl of warm water, its surface shimmering faintly, as if infused with something beyond comprehension. He dipped a cloth into the bowl and gently placed it on the boy's forehead, murmuring words that seemed to vibrate in the air. They weren't prayers, nor were they chants. They were something else, something ancient. The boy stirred, his lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. The healer motioned for silence, and the room seemed to hold its breath. He turned to his apprentices, nodding once. They brought forward a small pouch and emptied its contents into the fire. The flames hissed and flared, releasing a plume of smoke that filled the space, curling around the boy like a living thing. For those present, it wasn't just smoke, it was transformation. It carried the essence of rare herbs and resins, gathered from distant lands and blessed under the light of the moon. It was said to awaken the body's hidden power, to call forth the divine spark within that could heal what medicine could not. The boy's breathing changed, deepened, became steady. His mother gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. But the healer raised a hand, cautioning patience. The ritual was not complete. A serpent, sacred to Asclepius, was brought into the room. It slithered across the floor, its movements smooth and deliberate, as though it understood the gravity of the moment. It climbed onto the altar, curling itself around the boy's arm. The room remained utterly silent, every eye fixed on the creature. The boy's eyelids fluttered, and then, slowly, they opened. He looked around, confusion mingling with wonder. The serpent uncoiled and returned to the shadows, disappearing as quietly as it had come. His mother sobbed, falling to her knees, but the healer was already turning to another figure, a man with a bandaged leg, limping as he approached the altar. The ritual began again, different herbs, different words, but the same sense of something miraculous unfolding. These temples were not mere places of worship, they were sanctuaries of forbidden knowledge, where healing transcended the physical and entered the realm of the spiritual. Here, the healers practiced techniques that others feared or condemned, techniques passed down in whispers, protected by oaths, and performed with a reverence that bordered on awe. Some spoke of dream incubation, where the sick were placed in chambers and guided into profound, symbolic dreams. They said that Asclepius himself would appear in these dreams, offering guidance or delivering the cure. Others told tales of the sacred baths, where the waters, infused with rare minerals and herbs, seemed to draw illness from the body like poison from a wound. But not all were healed. For some, the rituals brought visions of their deepest fears, forcing them to confront the shadow within before any healing could occur. It was said that those who could face these visions without turning away emerged stronger, their bodies and spirits renewed. The temple also held a room, hidden from the uninitiated, where the healers performed acts that defied explanation. There, they worked with substances that bordered on the miraculous, potions and salves made from plants so rare that even their names were known only to the most trusted. These mixtures could dull pain, mend wounds, and, in some cases, seem to breathe life back into the dying. Yet, with every miracle came a price. The healers bore the weight of their knowledge heavily, knowing that their practices were forbidden outside the temple walls. If discovered, they risked exile, imprisonment, or worse. Still, they persisted, driven by a calling they could not ignore. In the darkest hours of the night, when the temple was quiet and the stars shone brightly above, the healers often gathered to reflect. They spoke of the lives they had saved and the ones they had lost, of the power they wielded and the burden it brought. They did not seek recognition or reward, their purpose was higher, their path chosen not by themselves but by the will of something greater. And so, the temple remained a beacon for those who had lost all hope. Pilgrims traveled from far and wide, braving treacherous roads and harsh elements for a chance to stand within its sacred walls. They carried their pain, their fear, their despair, and they left with something they had thought impossible, a glimmer of light, a reason to believe again. In the flickering glow of the fire, the healers continued their work, their hands steady, their hearts open. They were guardians of a legacy that stretched back through countless generations, keepers of a wisdom that refused to be extinguished. And as the boy on the altar sat up, his face alight with newfound life, the room was filled not with applause or celebration, but with a quiet, profound sense of wonder. Because in that moment, everyone present knew they had witnessed something sacred, something that could never be fully explained, only felt. And that feeling, fragile yet unshakable, was enough. The moon hung low, casting its silver glow across the ancient temple, where the air felt thick with anticipation. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the scent of earth and incense, mingling in the cool night. At the center of the sacred space, a group of priests stood in silence, their faces set with quiet determination. The crowd gathered around them, waiting. No one spoke, for the ritual had begun. A figure stepped forward, draped in a robe of deep midnight blue, his hands raised to the heavens. The crowd held its breath as the figure began to chant, his voice low and steady, carrying with it an ancient power. His words were strange and unfamiliar, yet they seemed to vibrate with a familiar force, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. The air shifted, growing heavier, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The figure's form began to blur, his body seeming to dissolve into the mist that swirled at his feet. Slowly, impossibly, his shape started to change. His arms grew long, his fingers elongating into claws. His face twisted, the features sharpening, and in the space of a heartbeat, he was no longer a man but a beast, a wolf, fierce and untamed, its eyes glowing with an eerie light. Gasps of awe rippled through the crowd as the transformation took shape, the sound of bones shifting and muscles stretching echoing through the temple like the beat of a drum. The wolf paced in a slow circle around the altar, its movements graceful yet predatory. For a moment, the crowd seemed to forget to breathe. There was power in this sight, a connection between the divine and the primal, something that no one could truly understand, but all could feel. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the wolf shifted again, returning to the form of the man who had once stood in its place. The ritual was complete. But in that moment, something had changed in the eyes of those who had witnessed it. They had seen the boundaries between man and beast, between the mortal and the divine, blur and dissolve. They had witnessed something ancient, something that defied reason and touched something deeper within. In the quiet that followed, the priests offered no explanations, no answers. They simply stood, their faces serene, their hands still raised to the stars. The crowd lingered, unsure of what had just transpired, but knowing that they had been part of something far greater than themselves. This was the power of transformation, of shape-shifting, the power to transcend the limitations of the human body and become something more. It was a ritual that connected the participants with the gods, with the spirits of animals that roamed the earth, and with the forces of nature itself. It was a reminder that humanity, for all its greatness, was still deeply connected to the wild, the untamed, and the divine. In ancient Greek rituals, animal transformations were not just metaphors. They were seen as a means of connecting with the divine, of stepping outside the confines of the human body to embrace the spirit of the animal. The transformation was not just physical, it was spiritual, an elevation of the soul to a higher plane. For the priest or priestess who underwent such a change, the experience was both a privilege and a test. To transform into an animal was to step into the shoes of the gods themselves, to walk in the world of the divine. But it was also a journey into the unknown, a challenge to one's very sense of self. It required surrender, of the mind, of the ego, of the human limitations that kept one tethered to the world. In the animal form, one could feel the pulse of the earth beneath one's feet, the winds that whispered through the trees, the call of the hunt, the freedom that came with shedding one's skin. But it also came with a cost, the loss of control, the loss of reason, the danger of becoming too much like the very creature one was meant to embody. For those who returned from the animal form, there was a sense of having touched something eternal, something beyond the veil of human existence. They carried with them the wisdom of the beast, the strength of the wild, the knowledge of the sacred. And yet, they were always changed, forever marked by the experience. The ritual of transformation was not reserved for just anyone. It was a sacred practice, carried out by those who were chosen, by those who had undergone years of training and initiation. It was not a casual affair, it was an act of deep reverence, of profound submission to the divine will. It was only those who were truly worthy who could undergo such a transformation and return to the world of men. In these rituals, animals were not simply symbols. They were partners, allies in the quest for spiritual growth. The wolf, the eagle, the snake, all were seen as messengers of the gods, each carrying its own unique power. The wolf was a symbol of strength and loyalty, the eagle of vision and freedom, the snake of wisdom and rebirth. To take on the form of one of these creatures was to embody their essence, to step into their world and understand their power. For those who witnessed the transformation, the experience was no less powerful. To see a human change into an animal was to see the gods at work, to see the boundaries between the mortal and the divine dissolve. It was a reminder that there was more to the world than the human eye could see, that the divine was always present, always watching, always waiting for those who were willing to listen. As the ritual ended and the people slowly began to disperse, there was a sense of quiet awe hanging in the air. The world had not been the same for those who had witnessed it. They had seen something that defied explanation, something that touched the very core of their being. And in that silence, as they made their way back into the world, they carried with them the knowledge that they had touched the divine, that they had seen the world in a way that few ever would. The ritual of animal transformation was not just about power, it was about connection. It was about understanding the divine in its purest form, in its most untamed, unbridled state. It was about becoming one with the earth, with the animals, with the gods themselves. And for those who experienced it, it was a gift that would stay with them forever. The sound of footsteps echoed through the darkness, each step a soft thud against the stone, reverberating off walls that seemed to go on forever. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and ancient dust, heavy with secrets long forgotten. And yet, somewhere in that endless maze, there was something more, a presence that could be felt, just on the edge of perception, lurking behind every corner, watching. The labyrinth of Crete was a place that many feared but few truly understood. A vast, twisting maze built not only of stone but of myths, of blood, and of ancient, forbidden rites. Those who entered did so with the knowledge that they might never return. It wasn't just the Minotaur they feared, the half-man, half-beast creature said to dwell in the heart of the maze, but the labyrinth itself, a living, breathing entity, a place where time seemed to slow, where reality itself bent and twisted. The walls of the labyrinth seemed to close in on those who ventured too far, trapping them in a maze of shadows and shifting pathways. No one could predict where the next turn would lead. But those who were chosen, those who understood the power hidden within the stone, knew that the labyrinth was not just a place of terror. It was a place of transformation, a place where one's soul could be tested, shaped, and remade. In the heart of the labyrinth, deep within the maze's inescapable corridors, the Minotaur waited. It was a creature of legend, a symbol of sacrifice, power, and punishment. Yet to the priests and initiates who entered, the Minotaur was more than a mere beast. It was the embodiment of something far darker, far older, a primal force that resided in the very bones of the earth itself. To confront it was to confront one's own deepest fears, one's own darkest desires. The Minotaur was not just an enemy to be slain, it was a reflection of the darkness within, a force that could never truly be defeated but only understood. The ritual was long and grueling, steeped in ancient practices passed down from generation to generation. Those chosen to enter the labyrinth were carefully prepared, their minds and bodies honed through hours of prayer, fasting, and meditation. They were given a simple task, to navigate the maze and face the creature in its lair. To succeed would mean transformation, a rebirth into something greater. To fail, however, was far worse. It meant becoming part of the maze itself, a forgotten soul lost to time. As the initiate descended into the labyrinth, the air grew heavier, the walls pressing in on them from all sides. Each step was measured, deliberate, a test of willpower as much as it was a test of strength. The walls seemed to pulse with a rhythm of their own, as though they were alive, reacting to the presence of the initiate within. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of something deep within the stone, moving. The Minotaur's lair was said to be the very heart of the labyrinth, a place where the stone itself seemed to breathe. It was here that the final trial would take place, a confrontation between man and monster, light and darkness. Yet, In the hearts of those who entered, there was something more, the knowledge that the creature was not merely a guardian of the maze, but a test of the soul. To face the Minotaur was to confront the inner darkness, to look into the abyss and see not just a monster, but oneself. Those who had returned from the labyrinth spoke little of what they had seen. The experience was too harrowing, too personal, to put into words. Some claimed that the creature did not attack them, but rather tested them, forcing them to confront their deepest fears and desires. Others spoke of the strange, mystical aura that surrounded the creature, a force that seemed to pulse with power beyond understanding. But what was most disturbing about the labyrinth was not the creature, it was the sense of inevitability, the sense that once you entered, there was no going back. The walls whispered to you, urging you forward, leading you down paths you did not want to take, into corners of your mind that were better left unexplored. There was a darkness at the heart of the labyrinth, a place where the veil between the mortal world and the divine grew thin. In that space, the initiate was forced to reckon with themselves, to face their own inner monster. The Minotaur was not just a beast to be slain, it was a reflection of the part of them that they could not control, the part of them that they feared. To defeat it, to emerge from the labyrinth, meant more than survival. It meant mastery over oneself. The rituals that surrounded the labyrinth were ancient and powerful, designed not just to test the body, but to forge the soul. To enter the labyrinth was to embark on a journey into the heart of darkness, a journey that would change you forever. Some came out stronger, wiser, their minds sharpened by the experience. Others never returned, their bodies lost to the maze, their souls forever trapped in the depths of the earth. In the myths, the labyrinth was a place of exile, of punishment, where those who were deemed unworthy were cast into the endless maze to die. But to those who understood its true nature, it was something more. It was a place of transformation, a sacred space where the veil between the mortal world and the divine could be pierced, where the initiate could become something more than human. The Minotaur was not just a monster to be defeated, it was a force of nature, a primal being that connected the initiate to something older, something beyond time. The labyrinth was a place of silence, of stillness, where every whisper, every footstep, every breath felt magnified, as though the very air held secrets that could shatter the soul. The initiate could feel it, the weight of history, of thousands of years of rituals, of sacrifices made in the name of the gods. The labyrinth was a place of power, a place where the line between the mortal and the divine was blurred, where the soul could be tested and reborn. To face the Minotaur in that place, in the heart of the labyrinth, was to face everything, every fear, every regret, every part of yourself that you had hidden away. And when the walls closed in, when the creature emerged from the shadows, there was no turning back. There was only the choice to stand and fight, to face the darkness head-on, knowing that victory meant transformation and failure meant oblivion. The labyrinth's secrets were not just in its walls, but in its silence, its power, its ability to strip away all pretense and leave only the raw truth of the soul. To walk its paths was to embrace something greater than oneself, a power that could either break you or make you whole. The statue stood in the dark corner of the room, cold and imposing. Its eyes, sculpted with terrifying detail, glared ahead as if piercing through the very soul of anyone who dared to meet them. The face was beautiful, hauntingly so, yet something in the gaze made it impossible to look for long. It was Medusa, her image immortalized in marble, her once soft features now frozen in fury. The snakes that crowned her head hissed, their forms twisting in the stone, capturing her curse for eternity. A chill ran down the spine of anyone who stood before her. In ancient times, the image of Medusa was not just a reminder of her tragic tale, it was a tool of power, of control, and of terror. Her image was used in rituals so secretive that even whispers of them were enough to send shivers through the bravest of men. To invoke Medusa was to summon something far darker than the myths had ever told. The curse of Medusa wasn't simply about turning to stone, it was about the loss of humanity, the stripping away of everything that made you feel alive. Those who dared to use her image in forbidden rituals didn't seek merely to wield her power. They sought to become something other than human, something inhuman, terrifying, immortal. The transformation was not subtle. Those who tried to tap into her power were often left broken, their minds twisted by the unbearable weight of what they had unleashed. To understand the rituals, one had to understand the source of Medusa's curse. Once a beautiful mortal, she had been transformed into a monster, punished not just by the gods, but by a world that saw her beauty as something dangerous. Her hair, once silken and soft, had become writhing snakes, each one a reminder of the cruelty she had faced. The rage in her eyes was not just born of anger, but from the pain of being betrayed, of being turned into something unrecognizable. And it was that rage, that intense, raw fury, that those who sought her power hoped to channel. They believed that if they could control her image, if they could invoke the power she held, they too would be able to wield the force of transformation, of domination. But what they didn't understand, what they could never grasp, was that Medusa's power wasn't something that could be controlled. It consumed everything in its path. To try to wield it was to invite your own undoing. In the dead of night, in hidden temples shrouded in secrecy, the rituals began. The image of Medusa would be placed at the center of the ceremony, an eerie, unsettling presence that cast a shadow over everything. Candles flickered in the dark, their flames dancing with a life of their own, as those in the ritual chanted ancient words, their voices rising and falling in a rhythm that seemed to echo the very heartbeat of the earth. With every word spoken, the air grew thicker, charged with an energy that felt almost alive. The participants would close their eyes, trying to block out the overwhelming sense of danger, the feeling that they were standing at the very edge of something they could never fully comprehend. Medusa's image loomed over them, her snakes writhing as if in response to their actions, her eyes burning into their souls. Some who were part of these rituals spoke of the strange sensations that came over them. A sense of coldness that seeped deep into their bones, as if the very essence of life itself was being drained away. Others claimed they could hear the whispers of Medusa herself, her voice a haunting melody that promised power in exchange for a heavy price. It was said that those who called upon her power could feel the stone creeping into their limbs, the sense of humanity slipping away as they transformed into something else, something more terrifying, more eternal. The rituals would end in the stillness of the night, leaving behind only the faint echo of the chant, the flickering candlelight, and the lingering gaze of Medusa. Some of those who participated left changed, their eyes dull and distant, as though a part of their soul had been taken. They would speak little, if at all, of what had happened in the ceremony. They knew that to reveal too much would be to risk their own undoing. Medusa's curse didn't just affect those who summoned her, it haunted them, leaving a mark on their very being that could never be erased. There were whispers in the shadows about what Medusa's image could do when invoked. Some said that it could turn enemies to stone, just as she had once turned her victims. Others believed it had the power to transform the caster into something far greater, a being of pure force and unrelenting will. But no one could truly understand the price of using such power. The rituals weren't just about taking control, they were about surrendering to something much darker, something more dangerous than anyone could imagine. Even those who had succeeded in tapping into her power couldn't escape the consequences. It was said that those who used Medusa's image were doomed to walk a fine line between power and madness. The curse that once turned her enemies to stone would slowly turn the practitioner themselves, eroding their minds until nothing was left but a shell of who they had been before. They had sought to control the rage, the darkness, but in the end, it was the darkness that controlled them. There were those who feared Medusa's image, who sought to destroy it, believing it was a curse upon the world. They burned her likeness in the streets, trying to rid the world of her terrifying presence. Yet the more they tried to erase her, the more powerful she became, her influence spreading like a sickness, infecting the very core of the cultures that had once feared her. It wasn't just her image that haunted the world, it was the idea of what she represented, beauty turned to rage, innocence turned to monstrosity, a reminder that no one could escape their fate, no matter how hard they tried. The curse of Medusa lived on, not just in her image, but in the hearts of those who dared to call upon her power. It was a reminder of the price of seeking power without understanding, of trying to control something so wild, so untamable, that it would ultimately break you. And still, the stories of those who invoked her curse lingered in the shadows, whispered among those who dared not speak her name too loudly, for fear that the very act of speaking it would bring her fury down upon them. The air was thick with tension, heavy as though the earth itself held its breath. In the flickering shadows, the serpent slithered silently across the cold stone floor, its scales gleaming like liquid silver in the dim light. Its eyes, sharp and knowing, locked onto yours, so still, so calm, as if it could see through the very depths of your soul. You could feel the chill of its gaze, a warning, a silent promise of what was to come. For centuries, the serpent has been a symbol, a figure that commands both fear and reverence. To some, it is a creature of darkness, a force of destruction. To others, it is something more, a guardian, a protector, a keeper of secrets so ancient that they have long been forgotten by the world. The symbolism of snakes, especially in the context of forbidden worship, is as old as time itself, stretching back to times when humanity first began to understand the power of what they could not see, but could only feel. In hidden chambers, deep within sacred spaces, the snake was not merely an animal. It was a divine messenger, a symbol of knowledge and transformation, a bridge between the material world and something far beyond it. Those who sought hidden truths knew that the serpent was the key. They would call upon it in their rituals, seeking to unlock the mysteries that lay just beyond the reach of human understanding. The snake was the guardian of this hidden knowledge, its sinuous form a symbol of the twisting paths that led to forbidden wisdom. As the ritual began, the participants would chant softly, their voices trembling in the air like the first notes of a song played in the dark. They would slowly step forward, their hearts beating in time with the rhythm of the serpent's slithering movements. It was in these moments that the power of the snake became undeniable. The very air seemed to vibrate with energy as the creature glided over the floor, its body forming a circle around the altar, a protective, yet ominous, embrace. The serpent, in its many forms, was always present in these rites, its role clear, to guard, to protect, and to reveal. The serpent's skin, with its constant shedding, was symbolic of the process of transformation. The rituals that invoked the snake sought to bring about change of the self, of the soul, of the world. To invoke the snake was to invite a powerful metamorphosis, but also a dangerous one. For those who were not prepared, the power of the snake could be overwhelming, consuming everything in its path, just as it consumed itself with each shed skin. There were whispered stories of those who had entered these secretive rites with pure intentions, only to emerge transformed, not in the way they had expected. The knowledge they sought was not given freely. It was earned, but it came at a price. Some were said to have emerged from the rituals with their minds clouded, their bodies changed, as though the very act of seeking the hidden knowledge had altered their essence. Others were never seen again, lost to the darkness, their fate sealed by the very serpents they had sought to commune with. Yet, for those who were brave enough, or foolish enough, to press forward, the rewards were said to be extraordinary. It was in these sacred, forbidden spaces that the snake revealed its greatest power, the ability to transcend the ordinary world, to see beyond the veil of time and space. To those who could see with the eyes of the serpent, the world was no longer bound by the rules of mortal men. Secrets of the universe, the nature of life and death, the hidden forces that governed all things, these were the truths that the serpent held, locked away in its coiling form. In these rituals, the snake was not just a creature of flesh and bone, it was a vessel for something far greater. Those who sought to unlock its power knew that they had to surrender themselves completely to its influence. The snake did not reveal its secrets to the weak or the unprepared. It tested those who approached it, waiting for the moment when they were most vulnerable, most ready to accept the truth. And when that moment came, the snake would strike, not with venom, but with knowledge so profound that it would shake the very foundations of everything the seeker had ever believed. It was said that those who were truly chosen to receive the serpent's wisdom would experience an overwhelming sensation, like a flash of lightning searing through their minds, illuminating the darkest corners of their thoughts. In that instant, they would see the world as it truly was, not through human eyes, but through the eyes of the snake. The veil would be lifted, and they would understand the hidden forces that shaped their lives, their world, their fate. It was a gift, but it was also a burden. To possess such knowledge was to become something more, something different. And with that transformation came the knowledge that you could never go back to the way things had been before. The rituals were always conducted in secret, hidden from the eyes of those who were unworthy, unready for the transformation. But there were always those who sought the snake's wisdom, driven by a hunger that could never be satisfied. They came from every corner of the world, from every walk of life, all seeking the same thing, the power to understand, to see, to transcend. They came with offerings of gold, of incense, of blood, hoping that the snake would accept their gifts and grant them the wisdom they so desperately craved. Some of them succeeded. Some were chosen. And for those few, the serpent's wisdom became a gift that could never be undone. They walked away from the rituals forever changed, their minds sharpened, their souls enlightened, their lives altered in ways that no one else could understand. But for every success, there were many more who failed, their minds consumed by the snake's power, their bodies left broken and unrecognizable, forever lost to the darkness that had claimed them. The serpent was never kind. It gave nothing freely, and it demanded everything. But for those who were willing to risk it all, the serpent held the key to a knowledge so profound, so hidden, that it could never be put back into the darkness. Once you sought the snake's wisdom, there was no turning back. The path was always twisting, always uncertain, always leading somewhere unknown, somewhere far beyond the reach of mortal hands. And so, the serpents continued to slither through the forgotten corners of the world, guarding the hidden knowledge that could never be fully understood, but could never be erased. The ancient rituals continued in secret, their power still just as dangerous, just as alluring, as it had always been. The snake remained, watching, waiting, guarding the truth that would never be fully revealed to those who were not ready to understand its cost. Pandora stood alone, the air around her thick with an unsettling silence. In her hands, she held the box, its ornate surface glistening in the faint light, as though it held within it the very weight of the world. A sense of dread twisted in her gut, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew what was inside, but she could not resist. There was something irresistible about the box, something that pulled at the very core of her being, something that demanded to be opened. The stories had always warned her, warned everyone. Don't open it. That was the warning, the rule. But how could she? How could she resist the pull of the unknown, the temptation of what lay behind that fragile lid? The box had been given to her, a gift of sorts, but one that carried a warning so ancient it had been passed down through generations, a secret buried in time. And now, in this moment, as she stood there with trembling hands, the weight of her decision was unbearable. She hesitated for just a moment longer, feeling the pulse of fate urging her to make the choice. The box seemed to hum with energy, as if it had a life of its own, beckoning her to let it speak, to let it reveal its forbidden contents. What could possibly be inside? What mysteries, what powers, what dangers? With a breath that shook her whole body, Pandora lifted the lid. It wasn't the explosion of darkness she had imagined. No, it was something far worse. As the lid creaked open, a cold wind swept out, swirling with a cacophony of voices, cries of pain, suffering, regret, all things that should never have been unleashed. Horrific, gut-wrenching sounds filled the air, each one twisting the very fabric of hope into something unrecognizable. And then it happened. The world seemed to collapse in on itself as despair poured from the box like an endless tide, choking out the light. But amidst the chaos, there was something else. Something small. Something faint. Hope. It was a soft, fragile light, shimmering faintly in the corner of her vision, almost lost among the overwhelming darkness. But it was there. Somehow, despite everything, it lingered, refusing to be extinguished. In the flood of pain and suffering that spilled out of the box, hope fought to survive, a glimmer of possibility that would not fade away, even in the face of utter despair. For the longest time, Pandora could do nothing but stand there, caught between the weight of her actions and the remnants of that tiny, fragile spark. The world had changed. She had changed. The box had taken everything from her, everything that she had ever known. And yet, in that instant, the box had also given something back, a lesson. Hope was always there, even in the darkest of times. It was never completely gone. It may have been overshadowed, buried beneath sorrow and regret, but it was always there, waiting, ready to rise again when the world needed it most. But what was the cost? Pandora could already feel it creeping in, the emptiness that lingered like a shadow in her chest, filling the spaces left by the horrors she had unleashed. Hope was powerful, but it was also elusive. It was a gift, but one that came with a heavy price. Those who carried it had to endure the weight of despair to find it, and in that search, they could lose themselves entirely. The rituals surrounding Pandora's box were never truly about the box itself, not really. They were about the lessons that came with it, the lessons that were never meant to be forgotten. They were about the fragile balance between hope and despair, the way they danced together in a delicate, dangerous tango. To seek hope was to face despair, to endure its crushing weight until one could rise above it, just as Pandora had been forced to. To open the box was to accept the inevitability of suffering, the knowledge that no matter how hard one tried, the darkness would always follow. But it was also about the possibility of something more, something better, something worth fighting for. And as Pandora closed the lid, the echo of her actions lingered, a silent reminder that some things could never be undone. The world was forever changed, and she would carry that burden with her for as long as she lived. But in the silence that followed, a question remained. Was it worth it? The cost of opening the box, the pain and sorrow that followed, was it worth the faint spark of hope that had been released, the fragile light that still burned somewhere in the distance? Was it worth the price of knowing that even in the deepest darkness, hope could still exist, if only for a moment? As Pandora stood there, holding the box once again, she realized the truth. The box had never been about the darkness. It had always been about the hope. It had always been about that one, tiny flicker that refused to be extinguished, no matter how hard the darkness tried to snuff it out. She looked at the box one last time, the weight of the knowledge she had gained pressing down on her like a heavy stone. The pain, the regret, the sorrow, she would carry them with her forever. But so would hope. And that, perhaps, was the greatest lesson of all. The creature stood at the edge of the firelight, its many forms flickering in the shadows. A lion's head, fierce and proud, growled low as its wings, like those of an eagle, rippled in the night breeze. The serpent's tail hissed softly as it slithered across the ground, its eyes gleaming like molten gold. For a moment, the air was still, heavy with the weight of its presence. The people who had gathered around the circle watched with awe and fear, for they knew what it meant. This creature, this chimera, was not merely a monster. It was something far older, far more sacred. It was a symbol, a living embodiment of the sacred rituals that bound the worlds of man and beast, flesh and spirit. In its very being, it carried the knowledge of the past and the warning for the future. It was the blending of forms, the coming together of opposing forces, the ultimate expression of both power and fragility. As the ritual began, the air seemed to thicken, the fire's light flickering like it too was uncertain. The shaman stood before the chimera, chanting softly, the words flowing like a river. Each syllable was a prayer, a plea, a command. The creature's eyes followed him with an almost knowing gaze. The ritual was not just for show. It was not mere spectacle. It was the reawakening of ancient power, the call to the gods that had once walked the earth. In the whispers of the wind and the flicker of the flames, the people began to understand, this was not about creating a monster. It was about blending the impossible, the sacred and the profane, to create something that held the key to their very survival. Each part of the chimera symbolized something deeper. The lion's head was strength, courage, and leadership. The eagle's wings were freedom, ambition, and the unshakable desire to rise above. And the serpent's tail, ever so sinuous, was wisdom, danger, and the subtle manipulation of fate itself, but the chimera was also a reminder of the dangers of tampering with the unknown. For every beautiful and terrifying thing it represented, there was a price. The creature was not just a symbol of power. It was a warning. A reminder that when you blend too much, when you force two worlds into one, you risk losing everything. For in the chimera, the forces of nature did not always balance. Sometimes, they clashed. The lion would roar in frustration, the eagle would spread its wings in defiance, and the serpent would strike with lethal precision. Harmony, if it existed at all, was fragile. The moment the balance tipped, everything could fall apart. The people stood silently, watching the chimera as it moved slowly around the circle. Each step it took was deliberate, measured. There was a grace to it, despite its monstrous form. It was a paradox, a creature that should never have existed, but here it was, breathing, living, moving. For the people, it was both a gift and a curse. They could feel it, the power that surged through the air, the knowledge that this being was not merely a figment of myth. It was real, and with it came an undeniable truth. The line between the human world and the divine had always been blurred, always shifting, always merging. As the ritual continued, the people's eyes grew wide. They could see it now, the way the chimera moved as if it were one creature, even though it was not. The lion's roar, the eagle's flight, the serpent's strike, each one was a different part, yet they all moved in perfect harmony. The power of the chimera was not just in its monstrous form, but in its ability to hold together these opposing forces without falling apart. It was a symbol of balance, of transformation, of the possibility of becoming something greater than what you were before. But as the ritual came to its peak, something shifted. The fire flared brighter, and the air became charged with an electric energy. The people felt it, an ancient stirring within them. The chimera, once still and poised, began to tremble. The lion's head snapped around, its eyes flashing with a raw, untamed fury. The eagle's wings beat wildly, sending the air around it swirling. And the serpent's tail lashed back and forth, as if it too were trying to break free. The people recoiled in fear, but they did not look away. They knew this was part of it. The blend of power, the merging of forms, it had to be tested. The creature had to be pushed to the edge, to the brink of collapse, to show them its true strength. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the chimera stopped. Its body, though trembling, settled. The fury faded. The fire dimmed. And for a brief moment, everything was still. The people waited, breathless, their hearts pounding in their chests. They had witnessed something beyond the ordinary, something that could not be explained, only felt. The chimera stood before them, exhausted but triumphant. Its forms were no longer at war with each other. They had settled into something else, something greater than the sum of their parts. It had become more than a monster. It had become a bridge between worlds, between forces, between the human and the divine. It had become a symbol of everything they could be and everything they feared to become. For the people, the ritual was more than a mere act of worship. It was a call to transform, to blend the parts of themselves they had always kept separate, to bring together the strength, wisdom, and power that resided within them. But it was also a warning. The chimera, in all its glory and terror, showed them what could happen when they tried to blend too much, when they tried to force something into being before it was ready. The balance was delicate, fragile, and the cost of losing it could be unimaginable. As the chimera turned and disappeared back into the shadows, the people stood in silence, their minds buzzing with the memory of what they had witnessed. They could still hear the echoes of the creature's roar, feel the weight of its gaze. The ritual had ended, but its effects would linger long after. For they now carried the understanding that in the blending of forms, in the merging of worlds, there was both great potential and great danger. And they would never forget the price of that power. The air was thick with the smell of burning incense, the soft murmur of chants filling the air. Ancient rituals, passed down through generations, were performed under the flickering light of the moon. For years, these practices had been the heartbeat of a culture, a way to honor the old gods, to connect with the mysteries of the world. But the fire in the center of the clearing was not only the symbol of life, it was the warning of what was to come. As dawn broke, the light felt different, cold, almost harsh, like a hammer smashing through the quiet reverence of the night. A new presence was sweeping through the land, its shadow growing longer, its grip tighter. The old rituals, the sacred chants, the reverent dances, all were being watched, judged, and slowly, relentlessly, erased. Christianity had arrived, not just as a faith, but as a force, as a change so vast, so complete, that it threatened to burn everything in its path. The fires of the pagan world would soon be doused, not with water but with fear, with the promise of damnation. One by one, the old temples that had stood for centuries began to crumble. In their place, new structures rose, cold stone and hard angles, filled with the scent of incense that felt more suffocating than sacred. The priests who once led the ceremonies, their voices carrying the weight of history, now found themselves silenced, their sacred knowledge erased, their lives turned into whispers that no longer held any power. The conversion was not a gentle one. It was not a gradual shift where the old gods were allowed to share the stage with the new. It was a takeover, a forceful push against everything that had once been revered. The pagans who had once danced under the stars were now forced to kneel before a single god, a god that demanded allegiance and obedience, not understanding or respect. To resist was to invite suffering, to invite punishment. The message was clear: abandon your old ways, or face destruction. And so, the rituals that had once breathed life into the land were pushed into the shadows. The sacred groves, where the earth itself seemed to pulse with power, were desecrated. The statues, carved with such care and reverence, were smashed and burned. The ancient festivals, filled with music and joy, were replaced with solemn prayers, with rules that stifled the soul, with chants that no longer carried the same warmth. In their place stood cold stone walls, prisons for the spirit, where the sound of human voices was drowned out by the silence of conformity. The people felt it. They felt the loss in their bones. There was no longer the freedom to honor the gods in their own way. No longer the freedom to seek the guidance of the earth, of the sky, of the stars. The old ways had been suffocated by a religion that demanded everything but offered little in return. Where there had once been a connection to the divine through the natural world, there was now only a book, cold, lifeless, and demanding. The gods who had once walked among them were now nothing more than legends, their faces blurred by time and the teachings of the new faith. But even as the old rituals were suppressed, there were those who refused to let them die. In the darkness of their homes, in the hidden corners of their villages, the old gods were whispered to once more. The fires were lit in secret, the chants sung quietly, as if the very air might betray them. They knew the risks, the wrath of the new priests, the punishment that came with defying the dominant faith. Yet, there was something deeper that kept them going, something ancient and fierce, a fire that refused to be extinguished. The stories of the old gods lived on, passed from one generation to the next in hushed tones and stolen moments. The rituals had become not just a way of life, but a form of rebellion, a silent protest against the erasure of their heritage. And in those stolen moments, there was a sense of defiance, a spark of hope that refused to be snuffed out. For as much as Christianity tried to force its way into the hearts and minds of the people, there was always something that could not be crushed, something that ran deeper than doctrine, deeper than the written word. It was the pulse of the earth, the rhythm of life itself, the old ways that could never fully be forgotten, no matter how hard they tried. But there were costs. The cost of holding on to the old ways was high. Some were caught, their secret rituals discovered, their lives destroyed in the name of faith. The fire that had once burned with passion now burned with the ashes of those who had resisted. The tears of the lost echoed through the streets, and the whispers of rebellion grew quieter, more cautious. It was as if the soul of the people was being smothered, the very heart of who they were being slowly crushed by the weight of a new, unyielding force. And yet, in the dark, in the quiet corners of the world where the light of the new faith could not reach, something stirred. The old gods did not vanish, they simply waited, their spirits lingering in the land, in the trees, in the stones. The people who had once worshipped them might have been forced to abandon their ways, but the rituals, though hidden, though forbidden, still had power. They always would. As the years passed, the old ways faded further into the shadows, a memory wrapped in longing. The temples were gone, the sacred groves vanished, and the songs of old were silenced. But the people who had once gathered in those places, who had once felt the earth beneath their feet and the fire in their hearts, could never forget. And in the quietest moments, in the deepest places of their souls, the rituals would live on, carrying with them the bittersweet taste of something lost, something that would never be fully extinguished. The candles flickered, casting strange shadows that seemed to dance on the walls, and the air was thick with an unexplainable energy. There was a moment, quiet and still, when the veil between the world we knew and something ancient seemed to lift, just for a breath. In the dim light, a figure stood, cloaked in layers of ritual, their hands poised above a small altar. The symbols etched into the stone flickered with a faint glow, as if alive, as if they remembered something. Something powerful. Something forgotten. What happened in that moment was not just the echo of a single soul, it was a connection to something much older. A connection to the ancient world, where rituals weren't mere performances but the very lifeblood of existence. The occult, the magic, the very forces of nature had once been understood in a way that felt almost tangible. Ancient Greeks, with their gods and their sacred sites, had whispered into the winds things that the modern world could only catch in fragments. And now, those whispers had come to life again. Not in the way the ancients had imagined it, but in a shadow of their magic, carried on through centuries, like a secret passed from one generation to the next. There, in that quiet room, the pulse of forgotten rituals hummed faintly, a heartbeat from a long time ago. The modern practitioners who gathered in the dark corners of the world, performing rituals of their own, often did not know that their very acts, of lighting candles, drawing symbols, chanting words, were borrowed from something far older than themselves. They stood, unknowingly, on the shoulders of giants who had once wielded power beyond comprehension, who had understood the forces of the universe in a way the modern world had forgotten. And yet, there was still magic in those acts, still power that seemed to slip through the cracks of time, like water through an ancient stone. Greek rituals, once thought of as forbidden, had not just survived, they had evolved. They had woven themselves into the fabric of modern magic, seeping into every crevice, into every whispered incantation, into every obscure book found in the darkest corners of libraries. The gods of Olympus, the ones who had ruled over the skies, the seas, and the earth, were no longer figures of the past. They were alive, breathing through the rituals that still took place, whether by accident or design, and places where the veil between worlds was thin. The rituals of old, the ones done in secrecy, away from prying eyes, were now revived by those brave enough to seek them out. In the quiet moments of shadowed rooms, in the flickering light of a candle, the ancient practices resurfaced. The offerings to gods long forgotten, the symbols that held power, the incantations that carried weight in the universe, were reborn. They were no longer rituals for the masses, but rituals for the initiated, for those who understood that the ancient ways, though buried, were never truly lost. There was something mesmerizing about it, the way the old practices had slipped unnoticed into modern magic. In every ritual, a piece of the past lingered, woven into the fabric of what could be considered occultism today. A circle of salt, a symbol drawn in the air, a prayer to gods whose names had once been forbidden to speak, these were the remnants of an ancient world that refused to die. The magic had not faded, it had simply become more subtle, more hidden, until it found new vessels to carry it. There was a strange comfort in it. To know that something so ancient, something so powerful, had been waiting for this moment to return. That, in the stillness of a night, under the watchful gaze of the moon, there were those who still sought the wisdom of the past, who still called upon the forces of the universe in a way that hadn't changed for thousands of years. It was not just nostalgia, it was a longing, a deep, instinctual need to reconnect with something that was lost, to pull a piece of the old world into the present. As the practitioner moved their hands, tracing an ancient symbol in the air, there was a moment when the room felt alive with energy. The ritual was simple in its appearance, just a few gestures, a few words spoken softly, but the weight of it was profound. It was a call to something ancient, to forces that could shape the very world. And as they finished the ritual, the room seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something to happen. And perhaps, in that very moment, something did. Perhaps it was the faintest shift in the air, the tiniest ripple in the energy that surrounded them. Perhaps it was just a feeling, a sense that the walls between the world of the living and the world of the gods, of spirits, of forces unseen, had blurred just a little. Whatever it was enough to make the heart race, enough to make the blood quicken. But these rituals, these practices, were never easy. They required more than just following a set of instructions. They required devotion, belief, and a willingness to face the unknown. The forces called upon were not tame. They were not easy to control. The gods of the ancient Greeks had never been simple, never been kind in the way that modern religions often promised. They were wild, unpredictable, and sometimes cruel. But they were also powerful, and that power was not something easily cast aside. In the corners of the world, where magic still thrived in secret, those who practiced these rituals knew the danger, but they also knew the truth, that there was something in the old ways that could not be replaced. The practices may have been hidden, but they were not gone. The Greek gods, the ancient rites, the old wisdom, they still lived, if only in the shadows. The power of these ancient rituals was not just in their ability to summon forces, to invoke the gods. It was in the way they connected people to something bigger, to something greater than themselves. It was in the belief that the world was not as it seemed, that there were unseen forces at work, forces that could be understood, influenced, even controlled. The rituals were a link to a past that refused to fade, to a world where the boundaries between the human and the divine were not so rigid, where magic could still be felt, where gods could still be touched. In this modern world, where logic often drowned out belief, the return of these rituals felt like a rebellion, a refusal to let go of something sacred. It was a refusal to be content with the ordinary, with the mundane. It was a deep, visceral need to reach out, to grasp something ancient and real, something that could fill the emptiness, something that reminded the soul that it had once been part of something much bigger. And in the flickering candlelight, with the whisper of an incantation on the lips, that ancient magic was alive again, as alive as it had ever been. The ground was cold, damp from the morning dew, as the archaeologist knelt beside the shattered remnants of something ancient, something forgotten. It was just another piece of history lying in the dirt, waiting to be noticed, waiting for someone to make sense of it. The wind was still, the only sounds the distant birds and the soft scrape of a brush against stone. But there was something different this time. Something that made the hairs on the back of the neck rise. The discovery was not just another relic, it was a whisper from a time that had long since passed, a time when the earth still held secrets of rituals lost to history. The stone, half buried, bore strange markings, symbols that had not been seen in centuries. At first, they seemed like just decoration, perhaps the work of a craftsman or the ornamentation of a forgotten tomb. But then the archaeologist noticed something: the symbols weren't just random. They formed a pattern, a language that, though unfamiliar, felt unsettlingly familiar. It was as though they were part of something bigger, something more profound. As the archaeologist carefully uncovered more pieces, the picture began to take shape. There were bowls, vessels, and tools, objects not meant for everyday use. These were ceremonial items, designed for rituals that were kept in the shadows, practices forbidden and forgotten. The realization hit like a cold rush. They had stumbled upon something that spoke of a time when these rituals were more than just traditions, they were the heartbeat of a lost culture. A culture that had known the power of the earth and the stars, the seen and the unseen. The study of archaeology had always been a methodical, careful practice. But sometimes, it felt as though the earth itself was trying to speak. Hidden beneath the layers of dirt and time were stories of forgotten gods, of forbidden rites, of human beings reaching beyond the known world to grasp something they could not understand, yet still sought to control. These rituals had been wiped away by history, hidden, erased, but they refused to stay buried forever. They were resurfacing, piece by piece, artifact by artifact, speaking through the remnants left behind. There was something eerie about these discoveries, something chilling in the way the earth seemed to guard its secrets. For centuries, the rituals that had once held power had been dismissed, their meanings lost in the shuffle of time. Yet, as more and more artifacts were unearthed, the story of these forbidden rituals began to shift. What had once been thought of as superstitions, as mere folklore, was now being reevaluated through the lens of archaeology. These rituals were not just the fantasies of ancient people, they were real. And they held a significance that was only now beginning to be understood. The symbols carved into the stone had meaning, real, undeniable meaning. They spoke of rites that were performed not just to appease gods, but to unlock something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface of the world. They were rites of transformation, of communication with forces beyond the physical world. In these ancient rituals, there was a belief that the boundary between the material and spiritual was thin, that with the right words, the right actions, the veil could be lifted, and the unseen world could be touched. But what could these rituals have been truly about? Was it simply a desire for power, for control over nature and fate? Or was there something more, a desperate attempt to understand the forces that shaped the world, a longing to reach beyond the ordinary and into the extraordinary? In those moments of quiet reflection, the archaeologist wondered if these rituals were not just the product of ignorance or superstition, but the product of a profound human need to understand, to connect, to transcend the limits of the known world. Each new discovery added another piece to the puzzle. From ancient temples to secluded caves, the traces of forbidden rituals seemed to follow a pattern, their significance growing clearer with each find. In one excavation, a group of bone fragments was uncovered, fragments that had been carefully arranged in a circle, as if part of a ritual sacrifice. The bones were old, their surface worn smooth by time, but the way they were arranged, the way they had been treated, told a different story. These bones had not been discarded or forgotten, they had been honored, used in rituals that had been seen as sacred. To those who performed these rites, the act of connecting with the spirits of the dead, the forces of nature, was not just a practice, it was an essential part of life, a link between the past and the future, the living and the dead. But as the years passed, these rituals were lost to time. The ancient temples crumbled, the hidden caves filled with earth, and the knowledge of the rites faded from the memories of those who had once practiced them. Christianity and other religions, with their promise of salvation and a singular truth, had swept across the land, erasing the old ways, condemning them as heresy, as evil. What had once been sacred became forbidden, its practitioners silenced, its rites buried deep within the earth. But the earth could not forget. Now, centuries later, the earth was speaking again. The forbidden rituals that had been condemned, that had been erased from the pages of history, were being revealed in fragments, in broken pieces. And with every piece uncovered, a new understanding emerged. These rituals were not just the misguided practices of an ancient people, they were part of something deeper, something that had been silenced but never truly gone. The rituals were part of a shared human experience, a way of connecting with something greater than the self, of reaching out into the dark unknown and trying to make sense of the world. There was a strange beauty in this process of reinterpretation, of seeing these ancient practices not as primitive, backward ways, but as profound expressions of human longing and curiosity. The modern world had once been so quick to dismiss these rituals as foolish or dangerous, but now, with each discovery, they were slowly being understood in a new light. The boundaries between the ancient and the modern, between the forbidden and the accepted, were beginning to blur. It was as though the rituals were not just buried in the earth, they were buried in the collective memory of humanity, waiting for the right moment to resurface. And with each discovery, that moment seemed closer, as though the past was no longer content to remain in the shadows. The forbidden rituals were not just relics of a time long gone. They were living, breathing things, waiting to be understood, to be remembered. The air was thick with anticipation, the room illuminated only by the flicker of a single candle. On the worn pages of an old book, the symbols were fresh, vivid, as though they had just been inked, lines and curves drawn by hands long gone, their meaning as elusive as the flickering shadows. The forbidden rituals of the past weren't just relegated to ancient tombs or forgotten temples anymore. They had crept into the very fabric of modern life, their whispers too loud to ignore. In the corners of art galleries, between the pages of books, and in the depth of film frames, these ancient rites were alive, breathing, thriving once more. It's impossible to turn a page in today's world without feeling their presence, without encountering the influence of forbidden rituals that were once erased from history, now echoing through the arts, through literature, and through the stories we tell ourselves late at night. From the darkest corners of pop culture to the most revered paintings, the long-forgotten gods and the taboos they inspired have taken on new life. The rituals that once caused fear, awe, and reverence now seem to belong to us, to our times, like a hand reaching out from the past, demanding to be seen and understood. The ink on the page of a novel isn't just ink, it's the breath of ancient storytellers, weaving together pieces of forgotten lore, bound in a narrative that feels too familiar, too alive. Whether it's the haunting rituals of H.P. Lovecraft or the dark magics of more contemporary fantasy tales, the same ancient symbols, the same forbidden rites, pulse through the veins of modern fiction. The protagonists in these stories, often torn between the known and the unknown, stand where the old and the new collide, as if the rituals of the past still have power in the present. There's something magnetic about the forbidden, something in the desire to peer into the shadows, to uncover the knowledge that has been hidden away. Movies too have been irrevocably shaped by these ancient, once forbidden practices. The frames of horror films tremble with dark rites, rituals that promise power, immortality, or chaos, but demand a terrible price in return. In cinema, the mystical and occult have become tools to create tension, to provoke the audience into questioning the boundaries of reality. It is here, in the flickering lights of the silver screen, that the forbidden rituals are no longer buried beneath centuries of shame or secrecy. They are the subject of desire, fascination, and fear. The forbidden has never looked more beautiful, never more terrifying. Think of the eerie symbols etched into the dirt beneath a candlelit circle, the quiet chant that seems to resonate beyond the walls of the screen. These aren't just fantastical elements, they are pieces of something real, something once feared, something that stirs up forgotten memories of ancient ceremonies. With every book, every film, the forbidden rituals of the past crawl from their resting places, cloaked in new meaning, taking form in ways that stir up a cocktail of emotions, curiosity, dread, and longing. Art, too, is alive with these influences. In every brushstroke, in every sculpture, the ancient deities, the shadowy figures, the eerie dances of ritualistic sacrifice and cosmic worship find a place. It's as if the artists themselves cannot help but draw from the well of the forbidden. The figures they create, with their haunting eyes and twisting forms, seem to speak to something deep within, something primal. The chimeras of ancient myth, the hybrid creatures of old, are reborn in new forms, often grotesque, often beautiful, reminding us that the line between the human and the divine, the natural and the supernatural, has always been thinner than we think. Yet the most powerful influence of these ancient rituals today is perhaps found in the way we grapple with the unknown, the way we struggle to understand the world around us. These rituals remind us that there is always something beyond our grasp, always something hidden just beyond the veil. In a world that is more connected than ever, with information at our fingertips, the rituals of the past whisper that there are still things we don't know, mysteries we can't solve, forces we can't control. The pull is undeniable. The forbidden has always had its allure. It's the human urge to peek behind the curtain, to know more, to confront the things that are meant to be left alone. These rituals, once lost to time, once swept away by the hands of those who deemed them dangerous, have found new life in the stories we tell, in the art we create, and the films that make our hearts race. Perhaps it's the danger that makes them so irresistible. The knowledge that comes with a price, the power that asks for more than we're willing to give, that makes us hesitate just before the final step. Like a siren song, the rituals of the past promise something that can never truly be had, only experienced in glimpses, in fragments. And in these fragments, we find a piece of ourselves, the piece that wants to reach for the stars, to grasp the unknown, to feel the thrill of something forbidden. In the heart of this cultural obsession, there is something ancient stirring, reminding us that the forbidden has never truly gone away. It has just changed shape. It has slipped into the edges of our world, hiding in plain sight, dressed in the clothes of modernity, wrapped in the packaging of art, literature, and film. We are drawn to it, not because we know it, but because it speaks to something inside us, a longing, a fear, a desire to touch the untouchable. The rituals of the past continue to live on in these creative expressions, not because we can make sense of them, but because we want to. In the darkness of these forbidden practices, there is a truth that resonates with us, a truth that we are only beginning to understand. It is the truth of the unknown, the unfathomable, the dark pull that keeps us coming back for more, always searching, always questioning, always yearning for the secrets that lie just beyond our reach. The night is still, the kind of silence that presses against your chest, making it hard to breathe. The fire in the hearth crackles and flickers, casting long shadows that seem to reach out toward the corners of the room. As you sit there, lost in the quiet, you can feel it, the weight of something ancient, something long buried, stirring just beneath the surface. It calls to you, soft but insistent, pulling you toward the forgotten places, the old rituals, the mysteries lost to time. It is the allure of the forbidden, and no matter how far we run, it always finds us again. There's something deeply human about it, isn't there? That desire to seek what was once hidden, to uncover the secrets that others dared not touch. It's not simply curiosity, it's a hunger. The stories of the past, the rituals that once seemed so dangerous, so forbidden, hold a power over us. They ignite something inside, a spark that refuses to die, no matter how many centuries pass. The deeper we dig into the ruins of ancient civilizations, the more we find traces of these rituals. They call out to us, urging us to ask questions that have been silenced for so long. Why were they hidden? Why were they forbidden? And more than that, why are they still so magnetic to us? There are moments when the world feels just a little bit too quiet, that you can almost hear the whispers of those who came before. They reach across time, across forgotten temples and ancient scrolls, urging us to understand. Their rituals, their mysteries, they weren't just stories to them. They were alive. Alive in ways we can barely begin to comprehend. Yet, for all our advances, for all the things we've discovered, we still long to understand what they knew, what they felt, and why they chose to hide it away. Think about the relics that have survived: carved stones, shattered pottery, weathered symbols. Each one, though worn and faded, speaks of something beyond its form. It's as if these objects have a pulse, as if they hold a piece of something much larger than ourselves. There's an undeniable sense of awe that comes with holding something so old, something touched by hands long gone. You can almost hear the faint echo of ancient chants, feel the presence of unseen forces, the weight of forbidden knowledge. And even though we may never fully grasp the depths of these ancient mysteries, we can't help but be drawn in, eager to learn more, to see beyond the veil. The allure of the forbidden rituals isn't just about the secrets they promise. It's about what they represent. These ancient practices were once the heart of societies, the very core of belief and understanding. They were sacred, powerful, dangerous. And it is this danger, this rawness, that makes them so irresistible. They offer a glimpse into something primal, something that still pulses beneath the surface of our everyday lives. Despite all our technology, our science, and our comforts, we are still the same creatures who once stood around fires, gazing up at the stars and wondering if the gods were watching. We still crave the mysteries of the universe, the truths that lie just beyond our reach. The more we uncover, the more we realize how much has been lost. But even in that loss, there is something beautiful. The fragments we find, each one holds a story, a piece of the past that refuses to be forgotten. It's easy to think of history as a series of dry facts, a collection of dates and names. But the deeper you go, the more you realize that history is alive. It's filled with emotions, with fears and hopes, with desires and dreams. And the forbidden rituals, the ones that slipped through the cracks, that were buried or erased, speak louder than anything else. They tell us about our ancestors' deepest fears, their most profound beliefs, and their most desperate yearnings. We live in a world that values certainty, that prizes the known and the familiar. But these ancient mysteries, these forbidden practices, remind us that there is so much we still don't understand. They remind us that there is beauty in the unknown, that there is power in embracing the things we cannot fully comprehend. The world of the forbidden is a world where anything is possible, where the boundaries between the real and the unreal blur. And maybe that's what makes it so compelling, that sense of possibility, of the world as something not fixed, but always shifting, always changing. Even now, in this quiet moment, you can feel it. The pull. The need to know more. The hunger for something deeper, something beyond the surface. It's in the way we search for meaning in our own lives, how we reach for something more than what we see around us. It's why the forbidden calls to us, because it represents all the things we can't control, all the things we can't yet understand. And that, more than anything, makes it impossible to resist. The rituals of the past weren't just about gods and demons. They were about life. About humanity's deepest questions, its greatest struggles. They were about grappling with the forces of the universe, with the powers that shape our world and our fate. And in a way, they still are. We may not perform those rituals anymore, but we still seek meaning, still search for something greater. The ancient mysteries have a way of staying with us, lingering in the corners of our minds, urging us to ask the questions that have no easy answers. And perhaps, in that search, we find something more than we expected. Maybe, in seeking what is forbidden, we discover a truth that has been waiting all along.